lights, let your shoulders drop, and take a deep breath. This is your time to unwind, to leave behind the noise of the day and settle into stillness. Let the gentle rhythm of words carry you, like snow falling quietly outside, until your mind feels calm and ready for peaceful rest. The snow fell in sheets so heavy it seemed to erase the world. The trees of Karelia stood like black skeletons against the whiteness, their branches cracking under the weight of ice, their shadows long and faint beneath the pale December sun. Somewhere out there, across that endless frozen silence, tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers trudged forward, their coats too thin, their rifles clumsy in the cold, their breath rising in thick clouds that betrayed their positions. They had come expecting an easy conquest, a march across Finland that would be over in weeks. Instead, they had entered a graveyard of snow, and one man, small and quiet, hidden in the frost, was helping dig it. Simo Häyhä did not look like a man destined for legend. Barely 5'3", with a round face and an unassuming frame, he could have disappeared easily into the crowd of Finnish farmers and hunters who made up the army that winter. He wore no insignia, carried no special equipment beyond his battered Mosin-Nagant rifle, and asked for no glory. What he carried with him instead was patience, skill, and a mind honed by years of living close to the land. And on those bitter days in 1939 and 1940, that was enough to make him death incarnate for the Soviet Red Army. The soldiers who feared him did not know his name. They called him something else, whispered it with a shiver, as if the sound alone might summon him. The White Death. The snow was his ally, his cover, his weapon as much as the rifle in his hands. Dressed head to toe in white, he was almost impossible to see against the drifts, just another mound of powder in a forest full of them. He did not use a scope, which might catch the glint of sunlight and reveal his position. He relied instead on iron sights, steady breath, and the endless patience of a hunter who had spent his youth stalking deer and foxes in the same forests. The men he targeted rarely saw him. Often they never even knew where the bullet had come from. They simply fell, and the Soviets around them scrambled in panic, eyes darting across the whiteness, searching for an enemy who might as well have been a ghost. It is one thing to kill in war. It is another to do it hundreds of times, in the span of only 100 days. In conditions so brutal that frostbite alone could claim a man's life. Simo Häyhä did both. By the end of the Winter War, he had recorded over 500 confirmed kills with his rifle, and hundreds more with his submachine gun. No sniper in history has ever matched such a tally in such a short time. Each shot was deliberate, each one the culmination of hours of stillness, of waiting in snow that could bury a man alive. Every trigger pull echoed through the forest like a heartbeat, and every kill was a reminder to the Soviets that in this frozen wilderness, death did not march in armies but lay hidden, patient, and precise. In every modern sniper school around the world, from the United States Marine Corps to the Russian Armed Forces, the story of Simo Häyhä appears like a ghost in the syllabus. Instructors bring up his name not as a distant curiosity but as a benchmark, a reminder of what is possible when discipline, patience, and adaptation are carried to their extreme. Though he fought with a simple bolt-action rifle and iron sights in the winter of 1939, his methods continue to echo in a century of evolving warfare. His story lives on not only in textbooks and classrooms, but in the conversations of soldiers who know that their craft, however modernized with technology, still rests on the fundamentals he mastered in the snow. For some, he is an inspiration, the small farmer who became the most lethal sniper in history. For others, his story is a warning that one man, invisible and disciplined, can paralyze entire armies and instill fear beyond the battlefield. Modern snipers operate in a world transformed by technology. They use rifles capable of hitting targets at over a mile, optics that magnify a target until it seems only feet away, and digital rangefinders that calculate wind, humidity, and trajectory with near-perfect accuracy. They are supported by drones that can spot enemies from the sky and radio networks that coordinate their every move. Yet, despite all this, the core lessons that Häyhä embodied remain unchanged. Technology may extend range and precision, but it does not replace patience, concealment, and the art of waiting. Every modern sniper is taught that the fundamentals matter more than the equipment. A steady trigger finger, an eye for terrain, the discipline to remain motionless for hours. These are lessons as relevant today as they were in Karelia's forests. Häyhä's ghost lingers in these fundamentals, proof that the most advanced rifle in the world means little without the mind and body to wield it properly. Camouflage is one of the clearest echoes. Häyhä's use of the snow was not only practical but ingenious. He wore white clothing when the Soviets trudged in dark wool uniforms, blending so perfectly into his environment that he seemed to vanish. He tamped snow around his firing position to prevent it from shifting when he shot, and he packed snow in his mouth to conceal his breath. These small details, simple, almost primitive, have been studied and repeated in sniper training ever since. Modern ghillie suits, crafted from burlap, netting and synthetic fibers, follow the same principle. Blend with the environment until you are no longer seen. Instructors remind their students that it is not always the fanciest camouflage pattern that saves you, but the smallest attentions to detail. Häyhä remains the model of how the environment can be turned into armor. Another echo is his refusal to rely on excess technology. He preferred iron sights because they did not fog or betray him with the flash of sunlight. In today's world of precision optics, that lesson still holds. Soldiers are warned about scope glint, the small reflection that can reveal a sniper's position to the enemy. They are taught to shoot through camouflage nets, to angle their lenses carefully, to avoid positioning themselves where sunlight can betray them. The principle is unchanged. Simplicity can sometimes be more reliable than sophistication. Häyhä's decision to avoid a scope has become a parable in sniper schools, a reminder that one must never trust equipment completely, and that the simplest tools often work best in the most extreme conditions. Modern snipers also learn from the way Häyhä understood psychology. His kill count was terrifying enough, but what truly broke Soviet morale was the invisibility of his attacks. Men marched in fear that the next step might be their last, that death would come silently from the forest. Modern doctrine emphasizes this psychological dimension. A sniper is not only a killer, but a weapon of fear. A single shot can halt an entire unit, forcing them to take cover, disrupting movement, delaying operations. This understanding owes much to men like Häyhä, who showed how one disciplined marksman could exert influence far beyond the weight of his rifle. In modern conflicts, whether in Afghanistan, Iraq, or Ukraine, the sniper continues to be less about raw numbers and more about shaping the enemy's behavior. Every time instructors explain this principle, they echo the lesson of the White Death. The endurance he displayed is another universal lesson. Today's snipers must still lie in position for hours, sometimes days, without moving. They must fight cramps, thirst, hunger, and fatigue, all while maintaining absolute stillness. Instructors use Häyhä as proof that such endurance is possible. He spent entire days buried in snow, unmoving, waiting for the moment to strike. His patience showed that survival is often about winning the war against one's own body. Students today are reminded that rifles and optics can be purchased, but patience cannot. It must be cultivated, as Häyhä cultivated it in forests long before he ever wore a uniform. But his story is also used as a warning. Armies study him not only to inspire their own marksmen, but to prepare for what happens when the enemy produces their own White Death. Modern counter-sniping doctrine, using reconnaissance, artillery, and specialized teams to hunt down enemy sharpshooters, emerged in part because of experiences like the Soviet attempt to stop Häyhä. His story is a reminder that failing to adapt to such a threat can paralyze entire formations. In Iraq, US soldiers felt the same chill Soviet troops once felt when facing insurgent snipers, the dread of unseen death. In Ukraine, both sides have deployed highly trained snipers to sow fear and disrupt movement, and commanders study men like Häyhä to understand how devastating such figures can be. The warning is clear: never underestimate the influence of one patient man with a rifle. Beyond military manuals, Häyhä's legacy lives on in culture. His name is invoked in documentaries and video games, in novels, and in conversations about what it means to be the ultimate sniper. Young recruits in Finland grow up hearing his story, and many around the world stumble upon the legend of the White Death and marvel at his simplicity. He is compared to modern snipers like Chris Kyle of the United States or Lyudmila Pavlichenko of the Soviet Union. But what makes his story unique is that he achieved his record in only 100 days, with primitive tools, in conditions that would have killed most men outright. That fact alone has turned him into both an inspiration and a myth. The myth carries its own lesson. Numbers can inspire, but they can also distort. Historians debate whether his exact kill count was 500, or fewer, or perhaps more. The truth may never be fully known, but what matters is not the figure itself, but the principle it represents, that endurance, adaptation, and patience can amplify the impact of one individual to an extraordinary degree. For modern soldiers, the myth is as valuable as the fact. It teaches them that the essence of sniping is not the rifle, but the mind behind it. It warns them that the enemy they cannot see may be the most dangerous of all. And so, in classrooms and training fields, the story of Simo Häyhä continues to be told. The farmer who became the White Death is not remembered only for what he killed, but for what he proved. That in the most extreme conditions, human endurance and discipline can achieve the impossible. For the young soldier learning to steady his breathing, for the instructor teaching camouflage, for the commander planning defenses against unseen enemies, the echoes of Karelia in 1939 are still heard. His story is both a beacon and a shadow, both an inspiration for those who hope to emulate his discipline, and a warning for those who might one day face someone like him. In the end, the lesson of Simo Häyhä in modern warfare is simple yet profound. Technology will change, rifles will evolve, and the battlefield will transform, but the fundamentals remain the same. Patience, concealment, adaptation, and psychological impact, these are timeless. His story endures because it speaks not only to soldiers but to the human condition itself. It tells us that resilience can magnify the power of one, that simplicity can outmatch abundance, and that even in the coldest, harshest corners of history, a single steady trigger can alter the course of a war. The White Death remains, not as a ghost in the snow, but as a lesson whispered to every soldier who picks up a rifle and steps into the uncertainty of battle. The cold was not a backdrop, but an actor in this story. Temperatures plunged to 40 degrees below zero, cold so deep that metal cracked, oil froze, and rifles refused to fire. The Soviets suffered terribly, their equipment failing, their spirits breaking. Yet Häyhä endured. He stuffed snow into his mouth to keep the vapor of his breath from giving him away. He built snow mounds in front of his position, packing them tight so that the muzzle flash would be concealed. He even tamped down snow beneath his rifle barrel so that it would not kick up a telltale puff of powder when he fired. The cold sharpened him rather than slowed him. It numbed the fingers of his enemies, but his own trigger hand never faltered. In the Soviet camps, rumors spread. They said there was a phantom out there, a man who could not be killed, who never missed, who blended so perfectly into the snow that he seemed part of the land itself. Whole units were paralyzed by the fear of him, slowing their movements, wasting ammunition on shadows. They shelled forests with artillery to root him out, sometimes bombarding empty ground for hours because a single Soviet officer had fallen with a bullet through his head. counter-snipers were dispatched, some of the Red Army's best, but none of them ever returned with his rifle. The White Death always saw them first, and Simo Häyhä did not do it for medals or recognition. He never wrote a manifesto, never boasted of his kills. When asked later in life what had made him so effective, he answered simply, "Practice." That modesty is part of what makes his legend endure. He was not larger than life, but almost smaller, a man who seemed carved out of humility, yet who wielded unimaginable power from the stillness of the snow. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a Soviet infantryman. You are marching through snow up to your knees, your rifle heavy, your breath freezing in your beard. Around you, comrades stumble, coughing, frostbitten, some collapsing from exhaustion. Suddenly, the man beside you drops with a hole in his skull, and then another falls a moment later. Panic grips you, but there is nothing to shoot at, no enemy in sight, just the oppressive silence of the snow and the knowledge that somewhere unseen the White Death is watching. You quicken your pace, every tree trunk a possible hiding place, every mound of snow a possible grave. You never see him. He sees you. The scale of Häyhä's accomplishment is almost too great to comprehend. 500 men in 100 days is not merely a number, it is a rhythm of killing that defies imagination. It means that every day, sometimes in the span of only hours, he turned the tide of battles one bullet at a time. The Red Army, which had expected to crush Finland with sheer numbers, bled out instead, demoralized by a farmer with a rifle who refused to miss. While Finland's armies fought in skirmishes and ambushes, Häyhä fought a one-man war, his kill count climbing like a grim ledger, proof that the cold and the land itself fought with him. The silence of the Finnish forest became his ally. In that silence, a single crack of a rifle meant death, and every crack belonged to him. He needed no speeches, no banners, no fame. His presence was enough. The Soviets never fully adapted, never fully overcame the terror he instilled. To them, he was not simply a sniper, but a force of nature, the embodiment of the snow itself. And yet behind the legend was still a man, small, quiet, who loved farming and hunting, who would return after the war to a life of obscurity. He did not kill for glory, but because his country was invaded, his people threatened. His legend was born not from ambition, but from necessity, and that is perhaps the most haunting part of all. The White Death did not set out to be history's deadliest sniper. He set out to survive a war in which his homeland stood on the edge of destruction. When we open this story, we open not just on a battlefield, but on a paradox. A man who became famous for making himself invisible. A man who killed hundreds but never lost his modesty. A man who survived the cold because he understood it not as an enemy but as a partner. The blinding Finnish snow hid him, but it also revealed the truth about endurance, patience, and the terrifying efficiency of one human being determined to fight back. Out of that snow, Simo Häyhä emerged not as a myth, but as something even more unsettling, proof that sometimes the most unassuming figures carry within them the deadliest precision, and that even in the coldest wilderness, history can be written by a single man with a steady hand. The world in late 1939 was already trembling. Hitler's armies had marched into Poland that September, splitting it with Stalin's Soviet Union under the secret terms of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Europe knew war was underway, but few expected that tiny Finland, perched on the northern edge of the map, would suddenly become the center of attention. Yet in November of that year, Stalin's Red Army poured across the border, convinced it would take Helsinki in a matter of weeks. It was meant to be a swift conquest, a border adjustment dressed up as national security. What followed instead was the Winter War, a conflict that turned the world's eyes toward a small, frost-bitten country and introduced them to a quiet farmer named Simo Häyhä, whose rifle would do more to terrify the Soviet invaders than entire divisions. divisions. The roots of the war stretched back long before the first shots. The Soviet Union had always been wary of Finland. The two countries shared a long border, stretching through endless forests and lakes, much of it within artillery range of Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's crown jewels. Stalin and his generals feared that Germany, or any other Western power, might use Finland as a staging ground for attacks. In October 1939, Soviet diplomats demanded concessions, a lease on Finnish ports, ceding territory near Leningrad, and allowing Soviet bases on Finnish soil. For Stalin, these demands were framed as defensive measures. For the Finns, they were an insult, a prelude to losing independence only 2 decades after finally winning it from the crumbling Russian Empire in 1917. The Finns refused. They were proud of their hard-won sovereignty, small in number but determined to protect their land. When diplomacy collapsed, the Soviets staged a provocation, the shelling of a village near the border, which they blamed on Finland despite clear evidence it was their own doing. On November 30th, 1939, without any formal declaration of war, the Red Army invaded with nearly 500,000 men, backed by tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Against them stood Finland's army of roughly 300,000, under-equipped, poorly supplied, and with almost no armor. On paper, it looked like a slaughter in the making. The first weeks confirmed the imbalance in sheer numbers and firepower. Soviet bombers raided Helsinki, dropping hundreds of bombs, killing civilians and trying to break Finnish morale. Columns of Soviet tanks rolled through the forests, crushing everything in their path. Yet very quickly, the cracks in Stalin's plan became obvious. The Red Army, purged of many of its most competent officers in Stalin's brutal purges of the late 1930s, was plagued by poor leadership. Soldiers were conscripts from across the vast Soviet Union, many unfamiliar with the terrain, unprepared for the Arctic cold, and demoralized by an unclear mission. Their great machines froze in the winter air, their supply lines stretched thin, and their uniforms offered little protection against temperatures that plunged below -40. The Finns, by contrast, knew the land and the cold as intimately as they knew the calluses on their hands. They wore white camouflage suits that blended perfectly into the snow, skis that allowed them to move swiftly across frozen terrain, and woolen layers that kept them alive in conditions that killed the unprepared in hours. They fought with guerrilla tactics, ambushing Soviet columns, striking swiftly, then melting back into the forest. The terrain became their ally, the weather their accomplice. Soviet tanks found themselves trapped on narrow forest roads, easy prey for Molotov cocktails, improvised firebombs that Finns hurled onto engine grills and fuel tanks. Soviet supply lines were cut, men starved, froze, or deserted, while the Finns fought with a grim determination born of defending their homes. This was the world into which Simo Häyhä stepped. A reservist mobilized like many others, he was not part of a professional sniper corps or some elite unit. He was a farmer called up to fight for his country, handed his rifle and sent to the front lines. The scale of the Soviet invasion made his contribution seem insignificant. What could one man do against an army of 500,000? Yet the conditions of the Winter War gave unusual power to individuals. This was not a war of sweeping armored divisions or massive air campaigns. It was a war fought in forests where visibility stretched only as far as the next tree, in snowfields where a single man with a steady hand could halt an entire squad. It was a war where patience, silence, and knowledge of the land mattered more than brute force. The Soviets expected quick victory, but instead they found themselves bleeding slowly day after day in the cold. Battles like Suomussalmi and the Raate Road revealed the extent of their vulnerability. At Suomussalmi, a Soviet division of 45,000 was annihilated by fewer than 12,000 Finns, many on skis, who cut their forces into isolated pockets and destroyed them piece by piece. At Raate Road, The Finns ambushed retreating Soviet units, leaving thousands dead or captured. The myth of the Red Army's invincibility began to crumble, and with it rose stories of Finnish resilience, tiny groups of men holding off masses, small squads destroying tanks with little more than gasoline bottles and grenades, and lone snipers picking off soldiers who never even glimpsed their killer. In this crucible of ice and fire, Häyhä began to distinguish himself. He knew the forests of Karelia intimately. He knew how to move silently on skis, how to dig firing positions in snowbanks, how to survive in sub-zero temperatures for days without revealing himself. Every skill he had learned as a boy, tracking deer, waiting motionless for prey, pulling the trigger calmly even with numb fingers, translated perfectly into the conditions of the Winter War. The Red Army never stood a chance against men like him. But the legend of Simo Häyhä was more than skill. It was also about the psychological weight his actions carried. When soldiers fall to artillery fire, it feels impersonal, an act of war. When they fall one by one to an unseen rifleman, panic spreads. Soviet units knew that moving through the forests of Karelia meant risking death at the hands of the White Death, as Häyhä came to be known. Every step forward might be their last. They fired blindly into the trees, wasted shells on shadows, begged for artillery to destroy snowbanks that hid nothing but silence. His presence turned the cold into terror, magnified by the sheer hopelessness of fighting an enemy who seemed to vanish into the landscape. The Winter War set the stage for his legend because it was a conflict where individuals could make an outsized impact. Every Soviet soldier he killed slowed their advance, bought time for Finland, and bolstered morale for his comrades. His kills were not simply numbers. They were moments of resistance against a tide that threatened to overwhelm his nation. The invasion gave him a canvas of white snow, and on that canvas he wrote a story of endurance and lethality that still astonishes historians today. By February 1940, the Soviet Union, humiliated by repeated defeats, poured even more troops into the fight, eventually numbering nearly 1 million. They adapted tactics, brought in better leadership, and used overwhelming artillery to finally grind down Finnish defences. The war would end in March with Finland ceding territory, but not before the world had seen the Red Army exposed as clumsy and vulnerable, and not before the name Simo Häyhä became whispered as myth. The Winter War began as a geopolitical calculation by Stalin, but it became a proving ground for Finnish resolve and the crucible that forged Häyhä's reputation. Without that invasion, he would have remained a farmer, anonymous in his fields. With it, he became the White Death, a man whose rifle echoed across frozen forests and into history. The background of the conflict, the arrogance of Soviet planners, the resilience of Finnish soldiers, the brutality of the cold, was the soil from which his legend grew. The Winter War did not just shape Finland's history, it created the conditions for one man, armed with nothing more than a rifle and patience, to etch his name forever into the story of warfare. Long before the world called him the White Death, Simo Häyhä was just another farm boy in rural Finland, living in a village where the winters were long, the land was stingy, and survival depended on patience and skill. He was born in December of 1905 in the parish of Rautjärvi, a quiet borderland region not far from Russia. His family lived on a small farm, one of countless scattered across the Finnish countryside, where life was measured not in hours or days but in seasons, planting, harvesting, hunting, and enduring the winter. There was no glamour in this life, no grand stage. It was a life of chores, of tending livestock, of mending tools, of walking through deep snow just to fetch water. Yet it was here, in the monotony and struggle of rural Finland, that Simo developed the qualities that would one day make him a sniper unlike any other. He was not a large man. In fact, he grew up small and wiry, only about 5'3" when full grown, with a face that looked more boyish than intimidating. strength is not just a matter of muscle. It is endurance, the ability to rise early, to haul wood, to thresh grain, to work from dawn until dusk regardless of the weather. This daily rhythm built not only his body, but also his will. He learned to endure cold and fatigue, to keep his hands steady even when numb with frost, to focus on tasks that required both strength and delicacy. These qualities would one day translate directly to the battlefield, but as a boy he had no reason to imagine such a future. The forests around Rautjärvi were as much a classroom as any schoolhouse. From an early age, Simo hunted. It was not a sport, but a necessity. Game put food on the table and kept hunger from gnawing during the harsh winters. He learned to move silently, to track the faint signs of deer or hare across snow and brush, to breathe slowly as he sighted along the barrel of his rifle. A hunter's education is one of patience. Sometimes it meant hours of waiting, motionless in the cold, for the briefest glimpse of movement. Sometimes it meant taking a shot at distance, knowing that one bullet must be enough because ammunition was precious. These experiences honed his eye, trained his nerves, and taught him the discipline of a marksman long before he put on a uniform. The rifle he carried as a boy was a tool, not a weapon of war. It was as much a part of his life as an axe or a plough. Every farm boy in Finland learned to handle one not because of military dreams, but because it was part of survival. Wolves threatened livestock, rabbits raided gardens. A clean shot meant food, and a missed shot meant hunger. Over years of repetition, pulling the trigger became second nature. The sound of a rifle's crack in the forest was not remarkable. It was just life. For Simo, it became a language he spoke fluently, one that would later make him a figure of fear to men who had never known such familiarity with the land or the gun. In the long winters with snow piled high and darkness lingering for much of the day, Simo learned the value of stillness. A farmer must be patient. Crops take time to grow. Animals require careful tending. The land cannot be rushed. A hunter must be even more so. To sit in the snow for hours waiting for a single shot is to learn control over body and mind. Cold muscles cramp, minds wander, yet the hunter stays focused. Simo's quiet temperament suited this life. He was not loud or boastful, not one to draw attention. He was reserved, modest, almost shy. In the silence of the forest, such traits were strengths. He did not fidget, did not chatter, did not crave action for its own sake. He could wait, and in waiting, he mastered the art of patience that would later define his method as a sniper. His upbringing also instilled a certain frugality, a resourcefulness born of necessity. Finnish farmers did not waste. Tools were repaired, not discarded. Food was stretched, every part of an animal used. The same mindset applied to ammunition. Every bullet counted, every shot had to matter. A missed shot was more than disappointment, it was waste, a failure to make the most of what little was available. This discipline of conservation sharpened his accuracy. He did not shoot for practice with endless rounds as a professional soldier might. He shot to hit every time. By the time war came, missing was not in his nature. When Finland declared independence from Russia in 1917, Simo was 12. He grew up in a country defined by vigilance, where the shadow of its massive eastern neighbor loomed over every village. Military service was compulsory, and by his early 20s, Simo had joined the Civil Guard, a voluntary paramilitary organization that functioned as both a defense force and a training ground. There, he sharpened his skills in a more formal setting. He competed in marksmanship contests, often excelling despite his quiet demeanor. The discipline he had built on the farm translated seamlessly into shooting ranges, where he proved himself a natural. He did not seek attention, yet his results spoke for themselves. His steady aim, his ability to control his breath and nerves, set him apart. Those who knew him described him as humble, a man who spoke little and preferred action to words. He never sought the spotlight, never imagined himself a hero. To him, service was duty, just as farming was duty, just as hunting was duty. He did not see a line between the life he had lived and the soldier he became. To defend his land was an extension of the same instinct that had driven him to work the soil and protect his family's farm. By the time the Winter War began in 1939, Simo was 34, already seasoned by decades of rural labor and years of marksmanship. Unlike many soldiers thrust into combat, he was not learning under fire. He had already learned in the silence of the forest, in the stillness of snowbanks, in the patient pursuit of prey. War was different, of course, deadlier, more chaotic, more terrible, but the skills were the same. Where Soviet soldiers often struggled to even function in the cold, Häyhä treated the snow as a familiar companion. Where Soviet conscripts shivered, cursed and fumbled with their rifles, he moved with quiet confidence, his motions practiced and precise. He had grown up in this cold. It was not his enemy, it was his home. Perhaps the most important thing his upbringing gave him was perspective. War is chaos, and many men lose themselves in it. Fear, adrenaline, confusion clouding judgment. Simo remained calm, detached, focused. He was never boastful about his kills, never agitated. When asked after the war how he managed such feats, he answered with characteristic simplicity, practice. That single word reflects the mentality of a farmer. To sow, to reap, to shoot. It is all practice, repetition, habit, until it becomes nature. He was not a genius born overnight, but a man forged slowly by the rhythms of rural life. Each season, another lesson. Each hunt, another refinement. His life as a farmer may seem far removed from the sniper's nest, yet it was precisely that life that made his later transformation possible. The quiet fields, the endless forests, the long winters had been his training ground. The rifle had been his companion since boyhood. The patience of farming, the precision of hunting, the humility of rural existence, all converged when history called. He did not seek war, but when it came, he met it with skills sharpened not in academies or barracks, but in the frozen silence of Finland's backwoods. Thus, the man who would terrify the Red Army began not as a warrior, but as a farmer, not as a killer, but as a hunter. His legend grew out of soil and snow, out of the long patience of the countryside. The White Death was born not on the battlefield, but in the quiet fields of Karelia, where a boy with a rifle learned to wait, to aim, and to never miss. The legend of Simo Häyhä cannot be told without the rifle that never left his hands during those frozen months of the Winter War. It was not a sleek, high-tech sniper weapon with glass optics and custom parts. It was a humble Mosin Nagant M28/30, a Finnish adaptation of a Russian design first introduced at the end of the 19th century. Its stock was plain wood, its barrel unadorned, and its sights nothing more than the simple iron posts and notches that had guided shooters for decades. To the untrained eye, it looked like the weapon of an ordinary infantryman, not the tool of the deadliest sniper in history. Yet in Häyhä's steady grip, this rifle became a scalpel in a world of hammers, a precision instrument that turned simplicity into lethality. The Mosin Nagant had a history older than the man himself. It was the standard rifle of the Russian Empire and later the Soviet Union, a 5-shot bolt-action chambered for the 7.62 by 54mm cartridge. By the time of the Winter War, it had armed millions across Eastern Europe and Asia. Finland, having inherited stocks of Mosins during its independence and civil war, reworked the rifle to better suit its soldiers. The M28/30 was one such variant, with improved barrels and sights crafted by Finnish armourers who cared less about mass production and more about precision. Though far from glamorous, it was rugged, reliable, and deadly accurate when placed in the right hands, and Häyhä's Häyhä's hands were as right as they came. What made his use of the weapon remarkable was not only the kills he achieved, but how he achieved them. Most snipers of his era preferred scopes, optical sights that magnified targets and offered precision at longer ranges. The Soviets too fielded scoped Mosins, some with early PU optics. Yet Häyhä refused a scope. He relied only on iron sights, those simple front and rear markers that demanded perfect alignment of eye, barrel, and target. To some, this seemed almost primitive. To him, it was a deliberate choice born from both practical logic and the instincts of a hunter who trusted his own senses above all. There were several reasons behind this refusal, and each of them speaks to the mind of a man who understood that survival was as important as accuracy. A scope, for all its advantages, carried risks. The glass lens could catch sunlight and flash like a signal mirror, betraying the sniper's position to vigilant eyes. In forests filled with enemy scouts and counter-snipers, even the smallest glint could mean death. Häyhä would not risk it. By using iron sights, he removed that danger entirely. His rifle blended into the snow, his position concealed not only by camouflage but by the absence of anything reflective. His invisibility remained unbroken. Scopes also forced the shooter to raise his head higher above the rifle stock, exposing more of his face and helmet. In a battlefield where the margin between life and death could be the width of a tree branch, Häyhä sought to minimize his silhouette. Iron sights allowed him to crouch lower, keep his head tucked tight, and reveal only the smallest sliver of himself when firing. This meant that even if enemy eyes swept over his hiding place, they were less likely to see him. He became not only harder to spot, but harder to hit. His body merged with the snowbank, his rifle an extension of his form, both disappearing into the whiteness. There was another advantage, more subtle but equally decisive. Iron sights did not fog in the bitter cold. Optics of the 1930s were not the sealed, nitrogen-filled marvels of modern engineering. They could cloud with breath, ice over in freezing temperatures, or crack under sudden shocks. In conditions where mercury fell to -40, such vulnerabilities were fatal. Iron sights, by contrast, never failed. They required no special care beyond the discipline to keep them clear of snow and ice. They were as reliable as the rising sun, and Häyhä trusted reliability above all. And then there was habit. He had spent his life hunting with iron sights, his eyes trained to measure distance, wind, and movement without magnification. His marksmanship had not been forged in shooting ranges with expensive equipment, but in forests where every missed shot meant hunger. He did not need glass to steady his aim. His vision was legendary, tested and proven in competition and in daily practice. So sharp that fellow marksmen recalled it with awe. Where others relied on magnification, Häyhä relied on instinct, muscle memory, and a gaze honed by years of peering through frost and branches. The iron sights were not a limitation to him, but a familiar friend. His choice of simplicity was also tactical. A scope could give confidence, but it could also lure a man into overreaching, taking longer shots than were wise, revealing his position with noise and muzzle flash. Häyhä preferred close ranges by sniper standards, often within 150 to 400 meters. At these distances, magnification was unnecessary. What mattered was speed and precision. Sight the target, pull the trigger, and vanish again. With iron sights, he could align faster, fire quicker, and reposition without hesitation. His weapon did not slow him down. It was not a delicate instrument, but a workhorse, sturdy and straightforward, perfectly matched to the guerrilla style of warfare the Finns excelled at. The rifle itself, the M28/30, suited his philosophy. Built by the Civil Guard, it emphasized accuracy over volume, each barrel carefully machined. Its trigger was crisp, its balance steady. The Finns treated their Mosins like heirlooms, each one expected to perform with precision. For Häyhä, this was not just a piece of military equipment. It was an extension of the rifles he had carried all his life. The bolt action, the recoil, the sound, all familiar rhythms. In his hands, the rifle became less a weapon and more a continuation of his own body, a channel through which patience and skill became deadly action. Soviet soldiers fell by the hundreds before its iron sights. Many never even knew where the shot came from. To them, the simplicity of his weapon made no difference. What mattered was the man behind it, and the man had chosen the tool that kept him alive as much as it killed his enemies. The Red Army had more men, more guns, more artillery. Häyhä had simplicity, precision, and a refusal to complicate what he knew worked. In that refusal lay his strength. It is tempting to imagine that greatness requires advanced tools, that the deadliest sniper in history must have wielded the finest scope, the most advanced rifle. But Simo Häyhä's story reminds us that mastery lies not in the equipment, but in the user. His choice of iron sights was not stubbornness, but wisdom, a recognition that in war, the simplest solutions are often the best. He trusted his rifle because he trusted himself. He did not need magnification to see clearly. His eyes, his patience, his training did the work. There is a kind of purity in this decision, a stark contrast to the industrial chaos around him. In a war fought with tanks, bombs, and waves of infantry, one man lay in the snow with an old bolt-action rifle, killing with a single shot at a time. The simplicity of his weapon mirrored the simplicity of his approach. Wait, aim, fire, disappear. No embellishments, no distractions, no dependence on fragile technology. Just iron, wood, snow, and the steady will of a man who never missed. The Mosin Nagant M28/30 was not extraordinary on its own. Thousands like it existed. What made it extraordinary was the way Häyhä used it, the way he turned its limitations into strengths, the way he embraced its simplicity as part of his own philosophy. He needed no scope to kill. He needed no fancy gear to survive. What he had was enough, and in his hands, enough became legendary. The rifle sits today in museums and photographs, a relic of wood and steel. Yet it carries within it the echoes of those 100 days, when in the forests of Karelia, one man proved that simplicity, married to patience and skill, could overcome the most powerful army in the world. Every scratch on its stock, every groove in its barrel tells a story not just of war, but of the triumph of fundamentals. Häyhä's weapon of choice was not remarkable for what it was, but for what it became, a symbol that the sharpest edge in battle is not technology, but mastery. And so the White Death earned his name not through the complexity of his tools, but through the stark simplicity of his craft. A farmer's rifle, iron sights, and the unyielding discipline to use them. That was all it took. In his hands, all it ever would take. The forests of Karelia in the winter of 1939 were an endless sea of white. Snow lay in thick drifts that swallowed fences, barns, and even the outlines of villages. Trees groaned under the weight of frost, their trunks streaked with ice, their branches sagging like tired arms. To the Soviets, this environment was alien and suffocating, a place where every step was a burden, every breath a cloud that betrayed their presence. To Simo Häyhä, it was home. He had grown up in this whiteness, hunted in it, lived through winters where survival meant understanding snow not as an enemy, but as a companion. When war came, he did not merely fight in the snow, he became part of it, folding himself into the terrain until he disappeared entirely. His camouflage was not just a uniform, it was a philosophy, a merging of man and landscape that made him the ghost his enemies feared. He wore white from head to toe, the simplest but most effective disguise in an environment where everything else was white. While Soviet soldiers struggled in dark woolen coats and green uniforms that stood out like shadows against the snow, Häyhä's clothing erased his outline. The human eye is is trained to catch movement, to spot contrast against a background. By eliminating that contrast, he turned himself into nothing more than another mound of frost, indistinguishable from the hills and banks that littered the battlefield. When a Soviet soldier peered through the forest, he might see dozens of snow humps, each one identical, none revealing that beneath one of them lay a man waiting with a rifle. But clothing was only the beginning. Häyhä understood that camouflage was not about what you wore, but how you lived within the environment. He dug snow mounds in front of his position, packing them down until they formed small barricades. These served two purposes. They concealed him even further and absorbed the muzzle flash of his rifle. A shot without cover in the snow would kick up a puff of powder, a small but noticeable cloud that could betray a sniper's location. By tamping the snow firmly around his firing position, he prevented this, leaving nothing but silence and the sudden fall of his target. The snow mound also acted as insulation. Temperatures often plummeted to 40 below zero, and prolonged exposure could numb fingers, slow reflexes, or kill outright. Burrowed into a snowbank, Häyhä found shelter from the biting wind. He turned the cold itself into armor. What was misery for others became a tool for him, part of his ability to endure long hours of stillness. His camouflage was not only visual but physical. He adapted his body to the cold until he could lie motionless for a day if needed, waiting for the moment when patience turned into opportunity. Even breath could betray him. In that kind of cold, every exhale is a plume of steam, a small cloud rising above the snowbank. For a Soviet soldier staring across a field, such a plume might be the only sign of life in a white wasteland. Häyhä solved this with the same quiet ingenuity that defined all his choices. He filled his mouth with snow, cooling his breath so that it blended with the air. Instead of warm vapor curling upward, nothing appeared. His body vanished from view not only in form but in function, erasing even the natural signals of life. It is one thing to hide clothing or a rifle. It is another to hide your very breath. That small act, simple, ingenious, brutal, summed up the essence of his camouflage. He did not merely disguise himself, he erased himself. The Soviets never adjusted. They marched in long lines, their exhalations rising in visible streams, their uniforms dark against the snow. They moved clumsily, leaving trails of footprints that revealed their paths. Häyhä, by contrast, traveled lightly on skis, leaving behind minimal trace, gliding silently across the snow until he found the perfect vantage point. Once settled, he became invisible. Soviet counter-snipers and patrols scoured the forests, firing at shadows, bombarding snow mounds with artillery, yet rarely finding him. He had merged so completely into the terrain that he might as well have been part of it. The psychology of this invisibility cannot be overstated. Soldiers are trained to fight men, to see an enemy and return fire. But how do you fight what you cannot see? The knowledge that the White Death might be watching somewhere, anywhere, from a snowbank 100 yards away or from the tree line behind you, eroded Soviet morale. Camouflage in his hands was not just a tactic but a weapon of terror. It was enough for men to know that their comrades had fallen without a sound, that death had come from nowhere. Panic set in when there was no visible enemy to hate, only a sense of the landscape itself turning hostile. Häyhä's use of snow extended even to the management of sound. Snow muffles footsteps, absorbs echoes, and swallows noise. He took advantage of this by moving at times when wind or snowfall would mask his approach, settling into positions where even the report of his rifle was dulled by drifts and trees. To Soviet ears, the gunfire seemed to come from nowhere, blending with the natural cracks and groans of ice. His camouflage was total: sight, sound, breath, presence. He existed and yet did not. He was both hunter and ghost. The beauty of his methods lay in their simplicity. Nothing he did required advanced technology or secret equipment. White clothing, snow mounds, a handful of snow in his mouth. These were tools anyone might have used, yet few did with such discipline. His genius was not in inventing new strategies, but in perfecting the fundamentals. He understood that survival in that landscape depended not on overpowering the enemy, but on vanishing from them. The snow was not an obstacle to be endured, but a partner to be embraced. He used it as a cloak, a shield, a stage on which he performed the silent art of war. It is easy in retrospect to imagine this camouflage as glamorous or cinematic, to picture Häyhä as some ghostly figure drifting through the forests. The reality was harsher. To lie in the snow for hours meant aching muscles, numb limbs, and the constant threat of frostbite. It meant hunger gnawing at the stomach, thirst parched by frozen air, exhaustion clawing at the mind. It required a mental fortitude most men could not sustain, a willingness to suffer in silence for the chance at a single shot. Häyhä's camouflage was not only visual concealment but also a discipline of body and mind, a merging with the cold until he became as unfeeling as the ice itself. The effectiveness of these methods can be measured not only in the kills attributed to him, but in the failure of his enemies to stop him. Soviet artillery crews shelled entire forests in hopes of silencing one man. Counter-snipers prowled the lines searching for the slightest glint of sunlight on glass, but Häyhä gave them none. They set traps, sent patrols, even launched reckless charges to flush him out, but he remained untouched, hidden in plain sight. The snow was his accomplice, his closest ally, and together they defied one of the largest armies in the world. Later in life, when asked about his methods, Häyhä gave little away. He was modest to the point of reticence, rarely elaborating on what others described as genius. Perhaps to him, it did not feel like genius at all. It was simply the application of what he had always known, that in Finland, to survive the winter, you must become part of it. In war, that truth became lethal. The snow that had once sheltered his family's farm, that had fed his hunting and sustained his youth, now sheltered him as he defended his country. He was not a man in the snow. He was the snow. This, more than anything else, explains why the Soviets named him the White Death. It was not only his kill count, staggering as it was, but the manner in which he killed. He did not appear from trenches or fortresses. He appeared from the whiteness itself, as though the land had risen up to strike at them. To his enemies, he was less a soldier than a force of nature, the embodiment of a winter that swallowed men whole. In the end, Häyhä's camouflage was more than tactical brilliance. It was symbolic. It showed that even the smallest nation, armed with the simplest tools, could resist the mightiest invader by mastering its own environment. Snow, cold, silence. These were not disadvantages but weapons, invisible and omnipresent. In his white suit, with snow in his mouth and frost clinging to his rifle, Simo Häyhä was not simply hiding. He was reminding the Soviets that they did not belong in Finland, that the land itself would turn against them, that the whiteness they despised would become their grave. And so one farmer with a rifle became the White Death, not only because of the men he killed, but because he learned to vanish into the very snow they all marched upon. His camouflage was not artifice but transformation, and in that transformation lay his terrible power. The cold of the Karelian winter was not merely a backdrop to the Winter War. It was a participant, as decisive and cruel as any general. Temperatures plunged to -20, -30, sometimes -40 degrees Celsius, cold so deep it seemed to burn rather than freeze. For the Soviet soldiers sent across the border, this climate was as hostile as the enemy they faced. They had come from faraway corners of the USSR, from places where winters were gentler or where the state had not prepared them for the realities of Arctic war. Their coats were thin, their boots ill-suited, their rifles prone to seizing in the ice. They were men first, soldiers second, and the cold stripped them of even that, reducing them to shivering shapes huddled together in trenches that froze as solid as iron. For Simo Häyhä, though, the cold was not the enemy. It was the same winter he had known his whole life, a familiar companion whose moods and dangers he understood intimately. Where the Red Army withered, he thrived, turning the cold itself into an ally as lethal as his rifle. Häyhä had grown up in the depths of Finland's winters, and this gave him an advantage no manual or training exercise could replicate. From childhood he had chopped wood when the axe bit into logs so brittle they cracked with a single blow. He had skied through snow that buried whole fences, skied not for sport but for necessity, to reach school, to fetch supplies, to hunt. He knew the cold's tricks, how it numbed fingers until they lost sensation, how it leached warmth from exposed skin in minutes, how moisture became a prison of ice if left unchecked. He learned the discipline of preparation, the rituals that kept a man alive when the world turned white. To him, these lessons were as natural as breathing. For the Soviets, who had been rushed into Finland with little preparation and less respect for the environment, these were deadly mysteries. A Soviet column would march along a forest road, their boots crunching in snow, their breath rising in thick clouds. Soon their sweat would freeze against their undershirts, their toes would blacken, and frostbite would creep into their extremities. The rifles they carried, lubricated with oils meant for milder climates, stiffened as the cold turned liquid grease into glue. Bolt handles snapped off when men tried to force them. Triggers refused to move. A weapon that will not fire is worse than useless in war. It is betrayal. Meanwhile, Häyhä's Mosin Nagant fired smoothly because he cleaned it meticulously, stripping it of oils and relying on dry operation, a technique he had long practiced in winter hunts. His rifle was never trusted to factory maintenance. It was trusted to him, and he gave it the same care he gave to his life. The Soviets tried to dig in against the cold, but their methods betrayed them. Fires gave away their positions. Clumsy shelters collapsed under snow. Many froze to death without firing a shot. The Finns, by contrast, moved lightly, often on skis, setting up small, efficient fires hidden beneath coverings or not lighting them at all. Häyhä, like others in his unit, carried what was necessary, no more. His meals were simple: bread, porridge, whatever could be carried frozen and thawed in the body's warmth. He knew how to ration, how to chew snow carefully to avoid dehydration without freezing his lips, how to layer wool and linen so that sweat wickered away instead of soaking into the body. These details meant survival. The cold also influenced combat in ways that seem invisible at first. At such temperatures, sound carries farther, sharper. A rifle crack can be heard for miles across the frozen stillness. Häyhä accounted for this, choosing his positions carefully, building snow mounds to muffle the noise, and firing only when he was certain the shot would count. His patience, already remarkable, was sharpened further by the knowledge that in the cold, every mistake echoed louder. Where a less disciplined sniper might fire quickly and betray himself, Häyhä fired with the precision of a man who understood that silence was his truest weapon. The cold also slowed the body, dulled reflexes, made it harder for most men to pull a trigger with steady hands. But Häyhä's endurance and preparation inverted the equation. He trained his fingers to operate the bolt even while stiffened by frost. He practiced steady breathing, using the rhythm of his lungs to calm his body against the shivers that cold brings. He even lay in the snow for hours, his body pressed flat against frozen earth, letting the cold seep into him until he no longer felt it as an intruder but as a second skin. He learned to work with the cold rather than fight it. This adaptation extended beyond his own body to his tactics. He took advantage of how cold crippled his enemies. Soviet troops, slowed by frostbite, encumbered by stiff uniforms, and constantly struggling against numbness, became easier targets. Their movements were sluggish, their attempts at stealth betrayed by the plumes of their breath. Häyhä, chewing snow to cool his own exhalations, gave away nothing. He would watch through his iron sights as soldiers stumbled forward, their exhaustion plain, their hands fumbling with rifles that refused to fire. They were combatants in name, but victims of the climate in truth. When his bullet struck, it was less a duel between men and more an execution of the unprepared by one who had been forged in these winters since birth. The Soviets tried to adapt, but they never matched the Finns' natural intimacy with the land. They brought heavy equipment, tanks and trucks that sank into snowdrifts and froze in place. Engines refused to start, fuel turned viscous, batteries died. Infantrymen, lacking skis, plodded through waist-deep snow, exhausting themselves before they even reached the battle. The Finns, mobile and efficient, circled them like wolves around lumbering cattle. Häyhä moved with them, sometimes skiing for hours to reach a vantage point, sometimes lying still for a day in temperatures that would kill a man who had not prepared properly. His comfort in the cold gave him not just endurance but freedom. He could choose when and where to fight, confident that the climate itself was on his side. What is most striking about Häyhä's relationship with the cold is the lack of drama in how he described it. Later in life, when asked how he endured, he did not offer heroic speeches or tales of suffering. He spoke simply, as if it were nothing more than routine. Practice, he would say, the same word he used to explain his marksmanship. Practice meant decades of winters, of understanding how snow packed beneath skis, how frost formed on eyelashes, how to sit in silence without letting shivers betray you. To him, the cold was not a challenge to overcome, but a fact of existence, like the soil on his farm or the seasons in his fields. That quiet acceptance allowed him to transform the cold from an obstacle into an ally. There is something almost elemental in this transformation. Where the Soviet soldiers saw the cold as a devouring monster, Häyhä saw it as an equalizer, stripping away the advantage of their numbers and technology. Against tanks and artillery, Finland had little to offer, but in -40, the tank froze, the artillery misfired, the men collapsed. The cold leveled the battlefield, reducing the Soviet machine to the same fragile humanity as any other army. Häyhä stepped into that void and became the edge that turned equality into superiority. The legacy of his endurance reminds us that wars are not fought only by weapons and strategies, but by climates, environments, and the human ability to adapt. The Soviets had more men, more guns, more everything, but they could not adapt to the cold. Häyhä, small and quiet, with nothing more than a simple rifle and knowledge born of winters past, did. His survival techniques, snow as camouflage, layers of wool, dry rifles, snow in the mouth to hide breath, were not extravagant secrets. They were simple truths, practiced with discipline, mastered with patience. He proved that the environment, when understood, can be wielded like a weapon, sharper and deadlier than steel. The story of the White Death, then, is not just the story of a man with uncanny aim. It is also the story of a man who made the cold his companion. While others cursed the frost, he embraced it. While others froze, he endured. The sub-zero temperatures that crippled an army gave him the stage on which to write his legend. In the end, it was not just his rifle that killed. It was the winter itself, guided by the steady hands of a farmer who had long ago learned that to survive in Finland is to make peace with the cold, and in making peace, to turn it into an ally. To be a deadly sniper is not to be a glorified shooter. It is to become an organism of stillness, poise, and timing. For Simo Häyhä, the rifle was only the final instrument. The real weapon was patience, the capacity to hold a posture, a breath, a decision, for hours until the world opened a tiny window and he could place a single, irreversible shot. In the white emptiness of Karelia, patience and positioning were not optional tactics, they were survival. Häyhä's method was less about flashy marksmanship than about a long, quiet calculus. Where to put yourself in the snow, how long to wait without moving, how to read the rhythms of men in green coats who had never learned to move like ghosts. He made waiting into an art and positioning into strategy, and between those two disciplines he built a lethal career. Positioning began long before he ever lay down in a firing hole. It started with map sense and memory of the land, a farmer's mental atlas of ridgelines, hollows, frozen streams, and the predictable ways wind and sun shaped the trees. Häyhä hunted this landscape his whole life. He knew which knolls gathered drifted snow, which depressions funneled movement, where enemy patrols liked to gather when resting, and where they would stand to look out over a clearing. A good position offered more than a view. It offered fields of fire that covered likely avenues of approach. It had natural concealment to break the human outline, and it provided an egress route, some way to slip away after the shot before his fellow soldiers became bait. He favored positions that let him control the story of the encounter. Rather than sit in the open hoping to sight a target, he went to places soldiers would pass through. Narrow tracks through trees beside supply routes where soldiers trudged with sleds and ammunition, near foxholes and temporary encampments where men huddled to warm themselves. A sniper's perfect geometry is when the target must pass through your view because the terrain forces them to, not when you must search the forest hoping to find a figure. Häyhä placed himself where Soviet movement inevitably funneled, on the lee side of a ridge where tracks converged, behind a bank formed by a drift that made his muzzle invisible, or across a wide field where silhouetted men could be picked off against distant trees. Once in position, the second art began. Waiting. Waiting is not the passive thing people imagine. It is hours of micro-calculation, the choreography of tiny adjustments that must not become visible. To lie for 5, 10, or sometimes 20 hours without moving requires a physical discipline most never experience. Muscles cramp, joints ache. The cold forms painful crystalline lenses on eyelashes and eyebrows. Häyhä trained himself to resist reaction. He learned to shift his weight only through barely perceptible changes, to reposition clothing or iron sights without throwing shadows. When he needed to breathe, he timed exhales with falling snowflakes or passing gusts, so his plume would not betray him. He chewed snow to cool his breath and keep it from forming a bright cloud in front of his face. He used snowdrifts not only as visual concealment, but as cushions that absorbed small movements. A sniper's slightest head adjustment can be as loud to a hunter's eye as a shout in a sleeping village. Häyhä made his body's conversation with the landscape unreadable. Studying enemy movement patiently also meant learning patterns. Men move like weather, irregular but predictable over time. Patrols walked in certain rhythms. Officers visited the same foxholes after morning roll call. Supply drivers took the same curves to avoid the hidden stones. Sentries rotated like clockwork. Häyhä watched these cycles for hours. He noted when a unit's pace slackened, when troops relaxed in false security and their heads dropped. He learned to recognize the gestures of a machine gunner who raised his head to scan for targets, or the way a telephone operator would linger near a pole. He prioritized shots that would produce maximal tactical disruption. An experienced machine gunner killed could silence a belt of fire. An officer removed could fluster a platoon into a long, confused pause. Häyhä chose the perfect shot not only for marksmanship, but for its rippling effects on the enemy's behavior. Part of his patient calculus was distance and angle. Häyhä fought at ranges that balanced concealment with certitude. He rarely needed, and actually preferred not to use, extreme long-range shooting. He favoured mid-range distances where an iron-sighted Mosin Nagant could be deadly accurate in expert hands and where he could be sure of hitting vital areas. Closer ranges also made it easier to identify uniforms and distinguish between enemy ranks. It limited time for the target to react and for the Red Army to triangulate fire. Angle mattered too. A shot through the skull or the neck at a slight oblique makes no dramatics but ends life immediately. Häyhä aimed for the small head targets with a calm that came from practice and from the confidence born of patience. Timing then was about seizing the moment when the variables all aligned. A target uncovers briefly to shave snow from a boot. A squad pauses in a slight depression to tie a strap. An ammunition cart slows. These micro windows are the sniper's hourglass. Häyhä's patience allowed him to sit through dozens of non-events, and only move when the event presented itself. He would sometimes fire several shots in quick succession if multiple targets presented themselves. An officer followed by a radio operator perhaps, then melt back into the white. Importantly, he never lingered after a successful shot. He understood that the first instinct of the hunted is to search the obvious place. The second is to look where the character of the field told them the shot came from. A sniper who waits to be admired is a sniper who bursts into a cloud of return fire. That tactic, strike and vanish, required planning for mobility as the complement to patience. Häyhä would often prepare several positions close to one another, each with its own field of fire, and rotate among them during the day. This prevented patterns from emerging that enemy counter-snipers could exploit. The moment he fired, he broke down the firing position quickly and moved to the next prepared hide, leaving behind no obvious sign except perhaps a slightly tamped mound. Too subtle for hurried eyes and too ordinary for thorough inspection. These moves happened in the quiet minutes when Soviet troops were distracted or after an artillery barrage masked sounds. He treated the landscape like a set of stages, each one with its own props, and rehearsed the transitions in his head until they were automatic. Mental patience is as important as physical steadiness. For a long day in the snow, boredom is a real enemy. The mind tends to invent threats, become jittery, or seize on meaningless stimuli. Häyhä cultivated a meditative focus, attentive, not anxious. He listened for the real sounds that mattered, the particular cadence of boots on frozen branches, the metallic cough of an engine when a truck passed, the rustle of a coat when a man turned. He regulated his pulse deliberately, practicing breath control that allowed him to squeeze the trigger with minimal disturbance. There is a subtle art to pulling the trigger. Not a jerking release, but a smooth, absolute finish that aligns the barrel, the sight, and the human intent. That reflex is honed by doing the waiting work, hours where nothing happens until everything happens at once. Patience also meant moral clarity about targets and timing. Häyhä operated under a wartime ethic common among Finnish hunters and soldiers. Do not waste bullets, do not shoot innocents, and value the tactical effect. This ethic informed which shots he took and which he forwent. He was not a spree killer, but a focused instrument of defense. He prioritized those whose removal would protect his comrades and slow the invader. That restraint amplified his effectiveness. Each shot counted, each hit mattered, and the Soviet reaction was magnified because every death was someone they had not safely risked. Finally, positioning included using the microenvironment to shape the shot itself. Häyhä tamped snow to control muzzle flash, angled his shots to avoid the sun's glare that could mark his presence, and chose spots where the wind would carry sound away from likely counter-sniper lines. He accounted for the way cold tightened metal and altered ballistic behavior a little, small things that a hunter's eye would notice but a hurried soldier would not. He knew how to settle his body's heat into the snow so that he would not melt a small hollow that reveals his shape. He knew how to disguise his silhouette with branches lightly dusted so their shadow broke up the human line. These are not glamorous tricks, but the quiet work of a patient craftsman. Patience and positioning together made Häyhä a problem the Red Army could not solve. They could throw numbers, armor, and ordnance at the woods, but large forces cannot unlearn how to sit like a stone and wait. A man in the snow with that discipline changes the game from attrition to terror. Where tanks and troops depend on movement and mass, a single perfectly placed shot destroys coordinate trust. First the fear of the immediate death, then the paralysis that spreads when no one knows where the bullet will come from next. In the end, Häyhä's mastery of waiting and placement was a mirror of his life as a farmer-hunter. Long stretches of routine interrupted by moments where everything presumed to happen in a single heartbeat. He turned mundanity into readiness, boredom into a sharpened edge. The art of waiting without moving, of studying soldiers' rhythms, and of choosing the perfect shot is not cinematic theatre. It is austere, lonely, and demanding work. That austere craft made Simo Häyhä less a mythic assassin and more a consummate artisan of war, patient, immobile, ruthless in his precision, and always perfectly positioned in the white country where he had learned to be still. Fear is a weapon as sharp as any bullet, and Simo Häyhä wielded it without spectacle. The most devastating thing about his work was not the number of men he put in the snow, though that number, over 500 confirmed rifle kills in roughly 100 days, was staggering. It was the way those deaths were experienced by the living, sudden, inexplicable, and anonymous. Men died without warning, without a face to hate, and that uncertainty gnawed away at unit cohesion, discipline, and courage. The White Death was not merely a marksman. He was a deliberate campaign of terror that turned the very landscape into enemy territory. Rumour was the first amplifier. In the tight quarters of a march column or the cramped bunk of a field camp, stories travelled faster than provisions. A soldier returning from a patrol described a comrade felled by a shot through the skull. Another swore he had glimpsed a white mound move. A third claimed that no bullet could catch such a man because he was not really a man at all, but a spirit of the snow. Each telling made the next listener more watchful, more jumpy. Fear fed itself. The Soviets were not only losing bodies, but they were losing the sense that they could control risk. A patrol that might have moved confidently through a ravine began to hesitate, look left and right, waste time scanning for a ghost. That hesitation cost them initiative and sometimes their lives. What made Häyhä's terror so effective was the combination of invisibility and inevitability. In urban combat or daylight assaults, an enemy can be seen, flanked, or engaged en masse. Mistakes can be corrected by movement, by returning fire, by the threat of artillery. In the white emptiness of Karelia, by contrast, the hunter blended into the terrain. Nothing betrayed him, no plume of breath, no glint from optics, no displaced branch. When someone fell, the rest could not say with certainty whether it had been an accident, artillery, or the sniper's work. That ambiguity produced paralysis. Commanders found that their men were more easily rattled than their training accounted for. Units that should have been assertive became cautious to the point of sluggishness. Every soldier's eyes scanning tree lines for an enemy they could not see. The Red Army responded, as armies always do, with brute force and procedural answers, saturation fire, artillery barrages, and increased patrols. But these remedies often backfired psychologically. Bombarding a forest to flush out a sniper was expensive, noisy, and demoralizing in its own right. It turned the land into an inferno of shell fire, produced maimed trees and scorched earth, and still might not reveal the man who had fired the lethal rounds. For soldiers already anxious about frostbite, supply shortages, and the general chaos of poor leadership, the knowledge that commanders were resorting to such extreme measures suggested desperation. It looked like an admission that the situation had gotten out of control. That perception alone, of leadership floundering, further eroded morale. Counter-sniping efforts and trackers were also mounted, but these too played into the psychological effect. When an elite counter-sniper was dispatched and failed, or worse, went missing entirely, rumors swelled about Häyhä's invulnerability. The absence of visible success for those sent after him made the idea of a superhuman assassin more believable. To rank-and-file soldiers, even sober officers, the very fact that an enemy sharpshooter could wreak such havoc suggested that the forest itself had become an agent of death. The line between enemy and environment blurred, and that blurred line was terror's habitat. The White Death's impact reached beyond immediate units into the broader strategic psychology of the invasion. The Red Army's losses, taken in the aggregate, were demoralizing because they contradicted the narrative of Soviet inevitability. The Soviets had expected a quick campaign. What they encountered was a war in which the environment, weather, and a scattering of resolute defenders inflicted humiliation. Häyhä's work, while tactical in its immediate effects, contributed to the strategic perception of the campaign as costly and fraught. Internationally, those perceptions undercut the image of Soviet invulnerability. Domestically, within the Red Army, they fed a climate of blame and suspicion that had already been exacerbated by Stalin's purges of the officer corps. When men in the ranks muttered that the forest was haunted by a death dealer in white, it was not mere superstition. It was a symptom of a larger collapse of confidence. Even small practical measures the Soviets took were inverted into psychological disadvantages. Soldiers were ordered to move in larger groups to reduce individual vulnerability, but moving in formations made them easier targets for indirect fire and created cluster casualties when a single well-placed shot took down a squad leader and plunged the rest into disarray. They tried to keep sentries farther apart to avoid predictable patterns, but wider spacing reduced mutual support and increased each man's feeling of exposure. Attempts to light fires in defended positions to warm men and food had the dual effect of producing visible signals in the daylight and the stench of smoke that betrayed encampments at night. Each adaptive tactic was counter-adapted by fear. Finnish propaganda and stories, sometimes quietly encouraged, sometimes organically formed, did the rest. Tales of the White Death entered radio broadcasts, newspapers, and word of mouth, creating a mythic figure whose reputation outstripped even his actual body count. For Finnish soldiers, the idea of a single comrade who could so reliably pick off the enemy was a huge morale booster. It confirmed a narrative Finns told themselves, that small numbers, superior knowledge of terrain, and unconventional tactics could beat brute force. For Soviet soldiers, the myth was another psychological burden. Every shot that struck them down could be added to a ledger of an unstoppable hunter. This polarizing function of reputation, emboldening allies while terrifying opponents, amplified the practical effects of Häyhä's actions without him ever speaking a boast or stepping outside his snowbank. Terror of this sort also fractures trust in command. Troops under fire expect their superiors to offer guidance, to set a plan, to protect them. When men drop to unseen bullets, they begin to question orders that send them through woodlands, across frozen rivers, and into obvious kill zones. Leaders who once inspired obedience increasingly found their authority undermined as men looked at the landscape not as something they could brave, but as a conspirator against them. Hesitation, whispering, and a growing reluctance to move without explicit command. These were the micro-behaviors that signaled an army's psychological weakening. Häyhä did not need to kill thousands to effect strategic paralysis. He needed only to make each soldier doubt and each commander re-evaluate movement. There were darker social consequences too. Panic breeds scapegoating. Patrols and units accused one another of cowardice or incompetence. Officers assigned blame in ways that led to hasty executions and overbearing discipline which further demoralized the troops. The fear that a killer in white might be hiding in any patch of snow created a paranoia that could be weaponized by local commanders to enforce brutal discipline, and brutality in turn fed more desertions and friction. A fog of suspicion spread across ranks the way actual weather covered the land. On the other side, Soviet caution and used the Red Army's growing reluctance to press forward as cover for raids and counterattacks. Häyhä's work was part of a broader doctrine of psychological attrition. Small, hard-to-stop attacks that made the cost of advancement more than the Soviets were willing to pay. The White Death, therefore, was not only a phenomenon of one man's marksmanship, he was a force multiplier for an entire theatre strategy that relied on degrading Soviet morale. Yet terror wears two faces. For Häyhä himself, the knowledge that he inspired such fear must have been a moral burden even if he never articulated it. Eyewitness accounts and post-war interviews suggest he did not revel in kills. He was a practical man who saw his shots as necessary. That ethical quietness is important. The terror was not crafted primarily as a psychological weapon by design, but as a byproduct of exceptionally effective tactics. Still, once unleashed, the terror took on a life of its own, spiraling far beyond his individual intentions. The label White Death thus encapsulates both awe and dread. It described a lethal fact, a single sniper in white killing hundreds of enemies. It also described a psychological condition, the sense that the land itself had become hostile, that the normal rules of combat no longer applied, and that any movement might be the last. That terror forced the Red Army to rethink tactics, to expend resources on countermeasures that often cost more than they achieved, and to carry into the rest of the campaign a sense of unease they had not prepared for. In the final calculus of war, numbers and territory matter, but so does will. Psychological warfare, by virtue of reputation, unpredictability, and the erasure of visible adversaries, strips away will in ways artillery cannot. Simo Häyhä's legacy is inseparable from that truth. He turned solitude into strategy, silence into deterrent, and a simple life in the snow into a campaign of dread. The White Death did not just shoot men. He made them fear the very act of being. And in that fear, a small nation found breathing room against an empire that had expected to suffocate it quickly and decisively. Every legend invites pursuit, and Simo Häyhä's growing tally of kills made him not just an obstacle but an obsession for the Soviet forces pressing into Finland. By the time his name began to circulate among the Red Army as the White Death, commanders understood that their men's fear could not be contained so long as this invisible predator continued to strike unchecked. An enemy sniper who can kill a handful of soldiers is a nuisance. One who kills hundreds is a destabilizing force that infects morale. Häyhä had become that infection, and the Soviets sought desperately to excise it. They tried artillery barrages, counter-snipers, and a variety of tricks meant to root him out of his snowy lairs. Each attempt, however, met the same fate. The farmer with the rifle survived, adapted, and went back to work. Hunting the hunter became a grim, costly game in which the Soviets bled both bodies and spirit while Häyhä lay in his snowbanks, patient and unyielding. Artillery was the first blunt instrument wielded against him. The Red Army, with its enormous arsenal, believed that if they could not find the man, they could at least obliterate the forest in which he lay. Reports of sniper fire brought down barrages that shook the ground, shattered trees, and left craters in the snow. For most men, such violence was enough to scatter them in panic or leave them buried. Yet Häyhä's preparation saved him again and again. He dug his positions deep, not just lying prone, but carving small cavities into the snow, reinforced with packed mounds that absorbed shock. Snow, paradoxically, muffled explosions and swallowed shrapnel. Where a trench of dirt would have splintered, his frozen shelters endured. More importantly, he knew when to leave. He did not cling to a single nest out of pride. Once a shot was taken and attention drawn, he relocated, gliding across the snow on skis to another prepared position. By the time shells fell on his last location, he was already watching from a new angle, as if the forest itself had shifted him beyond their reach. Counter-snipers presented a more personal threat. The Soviets dispatched some of their best marksmen specifically to hunt the man in white, They watched for the glint of a muzzle, the faint outline of a mound that seemed too symmetrical, the flicker of movement across the snow. But Häyhä anticipated these hunts. He refused scopes which might have betrayed him with a flash of reflected sun. He concealed his breath with snow in his mouth, leaving no vapor trails for a rival to track. He tamped the snow around his rifle so no puff revealed his shot, and he rarely fired twice from the same spot. Where counter-snipers expected a duel of patience, Häyhä transformed it into a ghost hunt, never presenting himself for more than a moment, never allowing a predictable rhythm. Those who came for him often never returned, victims of the same ruthless calm they had hoped to break. The Soviets also experimented with deception. They propped helmets on sticks, hoping to lure him into revealing his position. They dangled mannequins or exposed parts of uniforms to mimic careless soldiers. These tricks might have worked on a man hungry for numbers, eager to shoot at anything resembling a target. But Häyhä's discipline was ironclad. He ignored bait unless he was certain it was flesh and blood. His patience spared him from the trap of false opportunities, and his restraint reinforced the Soviets' frustration. They wanted him reckless. He remained methodical. His kills were always deliberate, never frivolous. Beyond these tactical hunts, the Soviets tried to drown him in sheer scale. They advanced in masses, reasoning that a lone sniper could not halt the tide. Yet this very scale made them vulnerable. When hundreds trudged through narrow paths in waist-deep snow, each man became a silhouette against the whiteness, each officer a slightly different posture easy to pick out. Häyhä's rifle cracked, and a leader fell. The mass slowed, stalled, and bunched as confusion rippled backward. In attempting to overwhelm him, they only offered more predictable patterns for him to exploit. His invisibility, magnified by their density, turned their numbers into a liability. The attempts to hunt him carried their own corrosive effects on Soviet morale. Every time a counter-sniper was dispatched and failed, the legend of the White Death grew. Every artillery strike that leveled trees but failed to silence him convinced soldiers that he was untouchable. Rumors swirled that he could not be killed, that he was more snow spirit than man. It is telling that his most dangerous wound came not from careful counter-sniping but from chance. An explosive bullet fired wildly that struck his jaw late in the war. Organized attempts had achieved nothing but feeding the myth. For Häyhä, survival was not luck but constant adaptation. He rotated positions frequently, often preparing multiple hides in advance. He learned to listen not only for men but for artillery crews loading in the distance, for the distinctive whistle of shells. And he read the battlefield like a hunter reads shifting winds. His ears were as important as his eyes. If the tempo of Soviet fire changed, if patrols moved differently, he sensed the hunt and adjusted. His instincts, sharpened by years of stalking prey in the forests, told him when danger was near. Just as he had once known when a deer would spook before it bolted, he knew when a counter-sniper was scanning for him or when a patrol's attention shifted toward his last position. The failure of Soviet attempts to kill him reveals as much about their shortcomings as his brilliance. The purges of Stalin had gutted the Red Army's officer corps, leaving many units poorly led and reactive rather than adaptive. Hunting a sniper requires coordination, subtlety, and patience, the very qualities Stalin's paranoid system discouraged. Instead, Soviet strategy was brute force. Overwhelm with shells, flood with men, crush with volume. Against an adversary who embodied subtlety and patience, these methods backfired. They turned the contest into one of opposites, the mass against the individual, the clumsy against the precise, the loud against the silent. And in that contrast, Häyhä thrived. Yet survival was not effortless. Each barrage, each attempted duel, each frantic Soviet maneuver placed enormous strain on his body and mind. To sit under artillery fire, even in the best prepared snow hole, is to endure thunder that rattles the bones and sprays fragments that could kill by chance. To know that unseen eyes were searching for you every time you lifted your rifle is to live under constant risk. Häyhä bore this with the same stoicism that defined his character, but it was still a burden. The fact that he carried it for so long without breaking, without becoming reckless or careless, underscores the depth of his discipline. As the war wore on, the Soviet obsession with killing him became both a tactical necessity and a symbolic mission. If they could silence the White Death, they could reclaim some measure of confidence. If they could parade his body, they could prove to their own men that fear was unfounded. That they never managed it speaks volumes. His survival was not only a personal triumph, but a strategic defeat for the Soviets, proof that their overwhelming resources could be humbled by one man's cunning. When finally, in March 1940, he was struck in the face by an explosive bullet, it was less the product of a calculated hunt than the random cruelty of battle. He was disfigured but survived, and his reputation only grew. In a sense, the Soviets had their wish. They wounded the White Death, yet they had failed at their greater task. He had already reshaped the psychological landscape of the war. His very survival to that point had ensured that their pursuit, however violent, had come too late. To hunt a hunter like Häyhä was to fight against nature itself because he had become indistinguishable from the land he defended. Artillery could shake the ground but not dislodge him. Counter-snipers could search the tree line but never catch his outline. Tricks could be set, but his patience outlasted deception. The Red Army tried to kill him with all the tools of modern war and found themselves undone by the quiet resilience of one man who refused to be flushed out. Hunting the White Death became a metaphor for the entire Soviet experience in the Winter War. Costly, frustrating, and ultimately unsuccessful against a smaller, humbler foe who understood the snow better than they ever could. In the end, the Soviets hunted him with shells, rifles, and men, but he hunted them with silence, patience, and snow. And in that contest, it was not their quarry who paid the heavier price, but the hunters themselves. Simo Häyhä's reputation as the White Death has been burnished most by his astounding sniper record, but to understand his full lethality, one must look beyond the single crack of the rifle in the frozen forest. He was not only a patient hunter with an iron-sighted Mosin Nagant, but also a soldier who could step into the chaos of close combat and carve through enemies with a weapon designed not for stealth, but for storm. That weapon was the Suomi KP/-31 submachine gun, a Finnish creation whose blistering rate of fire and rugged design gave the men of Finland a fighting chance when Soviet columns pressed too close for rifles or artillery. For Häyhä, it was proof that his deadliness was not confined to long-range duels. He was just as capable when the battlefield closed in tight. The Suomi KP-31 was one of Finland's proudest contributions to 20th century weaponry. A submachine gun chambered for the 9x19mm parabellum cartridge, famous for its accuracy, reliability, and devastating effectiveness at short ranges. It carried a distinctive 71-round drum magazine that allowed sustained fire, a feature envied even by the Soviets, who modelled their own PPSH-41 heavily after it. In the hands of Finnish ski troops and infantry, it was a tool for ambush and disruption, spraying bullets into enemy formations before disappearing back into the snow. To carry one was to wield a piece of machinery designed for sudden violence, the kind that could collapse the morale of a patrol in seconds. Häyhä was not the archetype of a storming submachine gunner. He was small, compact, reserved. The picture of a patient man content to lie silently for hours. Yet when circumstances demanded, he shouldered the Suomi and unleashed a torrent of fire that shocked those who imagined him only as a solitary sniper. Reports from his comrades tell of entire Soviet squads falling to his bursts, of ambushes where the quiet farmer who could wait a day for one shot suddenly became a whirlwind of destruction, emptying drums into the massed ranks of soldiers who had stumbled into his kill zone. It was versatility in its purest form, One man capable of absolute stillness, then instantaneous, ruthless violence. His proficiency with the Suomi was not an accident. Like the rifle, it was born of practice and discipline. Farming life had given him a certain economy of movement, a directness of action that translated even to rapid fire. Where others might spray wildly in panic, Häyhä controlled the bursts, knowing that accuracy mattered even when bullets flew by the dozens. He treated the Suomi not as a blunt instrument, but as another tool to be mastered, another way to turn patience into power. In close encounters, when Soviet patrols swept through woods and his sniper's concealment was broken, the Suomi ensured that he did not simply flee. He became the storm inside the ambush, using the weapon's weight and recoil with the same instinct he brought to his Mosin. The psychological impact of this shift cannot be overstated. Soviet soldiers already feared the invisible marksman who killed from afar. To discover that the same man could emerge from the trees and mow down an entire unit with a submachine gun was to face a nightmare made real. The White Death was not a one-dimensional figure, he was death from a distance and chaos at close range. Every rumour magnified this duality, making him seem like an omnipresent force, able to strike in silence or in fury depending on his mood. There is an elegance in how his two weapons complemented each other. The Mosin Nagant gave him surgical precision, the ability to whittle away at the Soviets one life at a time, eroding morale with each unanswered crack of the rifle. The Suomi KP-31 gave him volume, the ability to annihilate groups in a sudden storm of bullets. One represented patience, the other aggression. One required stillness, the other explosive movement. Together they made Häyhä a complete predator, capable of adapting to any range, any circumstance. The tactical environment of the Winter War demanded such adaptability. The Soviets came not in small patrols but in columns, masses of men pushing along narrow forest roads, their supplies strung out, their discipline thin. A sniper could harass them endlessly, but sometimes the opportunity arose for greater damage. When Finnish ski troops executed Motti tactics, encircling and fragmenting Soviet forces into isolated pockets, the Suomi was often the weapon of choice to tear through surprised groups at close quarters. Häyhä joined in these maneuvers, showing that he was not merely a solitary hunter but also a soldier integrated into the broader rhythms of Finnish defense. His Suomi fire stitched across Soviet ranks like a seam of lead, amplifying the terror already sown by his sniper legend. The reliability of the Suomi also mattered. In temperatures where oil froze, bolts jammed and men cursed their weapons, the Finnish submachine gun proved robust. It fired when needed, kept pace with the ski troops' mobility, and delivered decisive blows in ambushes. Häyhä, meticulous as always, kept his Suomi in condition just as carefully as his rifle. To him, maintenance was not secondary but survival. The man who knew how to hide his breath in snow also knew how to ensure his weapons never betrayed him in the cold. It is easy to imagine him only as a ghost in the snow, a distant crack followed by silence. But the Suomi reveals the other side of his nature, the readiness to step into proximity with death and prevail not by hiding but by unleashing. The same patience that allowed him to line up a shot also allowed him to wait for the perfect moment to open fire with a weapon capable of cutting down dozens. He did not waste ammunition any more than he wasted rifle rounds. Every burst had purpose, every drum magazine expended at the moment of maximum effect. The Soviet perspective magnified this effect into dread. They had labelled him the White Death for his sniping, but once stories of his Suomi work spread, the moniker deepened into something even more terrifying. He was no longer confined to the realm of invisible sharpshooters. He was a man who could appear in the blizzard and reduce a squad to corpses before vanishing again into silence. It blurred the lines of combat expectations. Was the next threat a single bullet from a hidden bank or a sudden rattle of dozens from the trees? That uncertainty paralyzed them, making even well-armed units second-guess every shadow. For Häyhä himself, the Suomi was not about theatrics or myth. It was about practicality. A soldier cannot rely on one tool alone. He understood that war in Finland's forests was unpredictable, shifting between ranges, between silence and storm. To survive, one had to be ready for all of it. The Suomi KP-31 gave him that readiness. It allowed him to defend his comrades, to repel assaults, to engage when the enemy was too close for sniper fire. It was not about glory, but about function, another instrument in the quiet man's orchestra of war. Looking back, it is remarkable how seamlessly he shifted between the roles of patient marksman and aggressive gunner. Most soldiers specialize. They become known for one skill. Häyhä embodied both. That duality is part of what cements his legacy. He was not only the White Death who struck from nowhere with a single round. He was also the man who, when pressed, could stand his ground and turn his submachine gun into a wall of lead that left no Soviet standing. The Suomi in his hands is a reminder that lethality is not a matter of one style or one method. It is adaptability, the willingness to change pace and tactics depending on what survival and effectiveness demand. Häyhä never allowed himself to be trapped in a single role. He was more than a sniper, more than a farmer with a rifle. He was a soldier whose mastery of both patience and fury made him an enemy the Soviets could neither outweight nor outgun. In the frozen forests of Karelia, silence and fire often alternated in strange rhythms. A crack here, a burst there, then stillness again. Somewhere in that rhythm was a man in white, switching between tools with the same calm deliberation he brought to every task. Whether with his Mosin or his Suomi, the outcome was the same. Soviet soldiers cut down, fear deepening, and the legend of the White Death expanding beyond the scope of a single weapon. To face him was to face not just a sniper, but a complete warrior, a man who had turned every range of combat into his domain. When people first hear the figure, 500 kills in a little over 100 days, they often assume it must be exaggeration, propaganda, or myth. How could a single man, armed with nothing more than an iron-sighted rifle, possibly kill that many soldiers in such a short time? To understand it, you have to place Simo Häyhä's work in the precise conditions of the Winter War. The geography, the weather, the tactics of both sides, and the sheer incompetence of the Soviet invasion. His tally was not the product of impossible feats, but the logical outcome of one man's mastery operating within a unique environment where his skills met an endless stream of vulnerable targets. The math of 500 kills is the story of terrain, timing, and the mistakes of an enemy that marched blindly into the forests of Karelia. Start with the terrain. Karelia in winter is not a battlefield in the conventional sense. It is a labyrinth of forests, frozen lakes, narrow roads, and deep snowdrifts that turn mobility into torment. The Soviet army advanced in long columns, strung out along forest tracks, their tanks and trucks trapped to the road because the snow was too deep for them to maneuver freely. The Finnish defenders, light on skis, could move swiftly across the landscape, choosing where to strike and when to vanish. Häyhä used this terrain as a funnel. Soviet troops had no choice but to move in predictable lines along obvious routes, through choke points that offered clear fields of fire. Each narrow road was a shooting gallery, each clearing was a stage set for ambush. Häyhä did not need to go looking for enemies. They came to him, wave after wave, as the Soviets kept sending men forward into the same killing zones. Next, consider the scale of Soviet mistakes. Stalin's generals assumed Finland would fall in weeks. They sent hundreds of thousands of men without proper winter gear, without adequate training, and without respect for the conditions. Soviet soldiers wore dark uniforms that stood out starkly against the snow. They moved in mass formations, easy for a sniper to track. They lit fires that betrayed positions, marched noisily through forests where silence was survival, and often repeated routes without adjusting to losses. These were not elite troops hunting carefully through the trees. They were exhausted conscripts blundering into ambushes. For a man like Häyhä, disciplined and invisible, they might as well have been silhouettes at a firing range. The rate of combat also matters. The Winter War was not a slow, occasional exchange. It was constant pressure. The Soviets launched daily assaults, patrols and probes across the Finnish lines. For 100 days, Häyhä had nearly unlimited opportunity. In a conventional war, a sniper might wait weeks for ideal conditions. In Karelia, every sunrise brought new targets. If he averaged 5 kills a day, the total seemed staggering. But in reality, there were days when he killed far more, when Soviet attacks fed him 20 or 30 opportunities in the span of a few hours. His tally was not a steady drip, but a series of surges, the cumulative weight of relentless assaults that he was uniquely prepared to repel. His methods amplified these conditions. Unlike many snipers who rely on magnified optics and long-distance duels, Häyhä preferred medium ranges, 150 to 400 meters, where he could be absolutely sure of a hit with iron sights. That certainty kept his accuracy extraordinary. He did not waste shots. He fired only when the kill was guaranteed. Each bullet, therefore, turned into a body. Over weeks, that precision built into an avalanche of numbers. 500 is the sum not of reckless shooting, but of perfect economy. Every trigger pull chosen, every hit fatal. The environment also slowed Soviet responses, allowing him to exploit the same terrain repeatedly. Deep snow made it impossible for troops to maneuver quickly when fired upon. Once he struck, panic spread, and retreat or cover became clumsy. The cold froze men's reflexes, jammed rifles, and turned attempts at counterfire into chaos. Artillery barrages meant to silence him often fell too late after he had already shifted positions. The Soviet command, hamstrung by poor communication and rigid orders, often reacted hours after the fact. This lag gave Häyhä the freedom to kill, relocate, and kill again without fear of immediate retaliation. Numbers alone obscure the human side, but it is important to visualize the daily mechanics. Imagine a Soviet patrol of 20 men trudging along a road. One drops from a shot. The others panic, dive for cover, and scatter into predictable positions. In the confusion, another head rises too high. Another body slumps. Within minutes, 4 or 5 men are gone, the rest frozen in indecision, unwilling to advance, afraid to retreat. Multiply that scene by dozens of patrols over months, and the numbers accumulate. Häyhä's kill count is less a mystery and more an inevitability given the rhythm of a war in which the enemy refused to adapt. There is also the broader context of Finnish tactics. Häyhä was not alone in his efficiency. The entire Finnish defense relied on small, mobile units that excelled at ambush, harassment, and attrition. Motti tactics, cutting Soviet divisions into isolated pockets, created countless opportunities for individual marksmen. In these fragmented battles, Häyhä became a specialist, tasked not with charging, but with thinning the enemy wherever they clustered. His personal tally contributed to a larger system of asymmetric warfare that turned Soviet numbers into weakness. The 500 kills were part of a collective attrition campaign, magnified by the way Finnish soldiers understood their environment. Critics sometimes ask whether such numbers can be confirmed. Wartime records are never perfect, and in the chaos of Karelia, bodies often fell into snowdrifts and were counted hastily. Yet Finnish officers attested to his kills, and Soviet records of losses in those sectors corroborate the scale of devastation, even if the exact figure wavers, 400, 500, perhaps more. The math of how it was possible remains the same. Endless Soviet men marched into narrow kill zones. One man with unmatched patience and skill waited for them. Each day brought new victims. The psychological effect added another layer of opportunity. As his reputation spread, Soviet soldiers became jumpy, careless in their attempts to find him, exposing themselves to fire. Counter-snipers lingered too long searching for him, only to be killed themselves. Artillery barrages fired wildly at empty forests left gaps in Soviet defenses that Häyhä exploited. Fear created mistakes, and mistakes created openings. Thus, the number grew not only from his skill but from the compounding effect of terror. Each death made the next more likely, not less. By the end of his 100 days, the total was not the miracle of one superhuman but the arithmetic of conditions perfectly suited to him. A steady supply of exposed targets, terrain that forced predictable movement, weather that paralyzed the enemy, tactics that multiplied his impact, and an individual who never wasted a chance, never hesitated, never allowed fatigue to dull his precision. 500 kills is shocking when stated bluntly, but when broken down into days, patrols and patterns, it becomes the logical sum of inevitabilities. The math of Häyhä's record is also the math of a failed invasion. Each kill represented not only a life lost, but a reminder that numbers alone cannot conquer a land that refuses to yield. The Soviets had manpower, artillery, tanks, planes. What they lacked was adaptability, the humility to respect the environment, and the skill to counter a defender who embodied both. Häyhä did not win the Winter War alone. No man could. But his tally of kills symbolized the larger imbalance. A giant undone not by an army of equal size, but by the land itself, and by the men like him who knew how to turn every tree, every snowbank, every breath into advantage. So the number 500 is not myth, it is arithmetic. 100 days, dozens of opportunities each day, a man who never missed, terrain that funneled targets, an enemy that refused to learn. In the end, the White Death's record is less unbelievable than it first appears. It was not magic but math, not chance but calculation. And in that math, written in the snow with each fallen soldier, Simo Häyhä carved a legend that still defies the imagination. The cold in Karelia was not merely discomfort. It was a force that sought to unmake the body itself, stripping away dexterity, numbing nerves, and freezing metal until even the simplest mechanical action became agony. At -40 degrees Celsius, the human body ceases to behave as it should. Breath condenses into ice on a mustache, eyelids freeze together, fingers lose feeling so quickly that fine movements turn clumsy, and exposed skin can die in minutes. For most soldiers in those forests, the cold was as terrifying as the enemy. Rifles jammed, boots cracked, hands shook, and the mind dulled under the weight of shivering. But for Simo Häyhä, whose survival and lethality depended on perfect control of both body and weapon, the cold was another battlefield to master. His legend was not only about shooting with astonishing accuracy, but about doing so while others were barely able to hold their weapons steady. Frozen fingers should have meant missed shots, but for Häyhä they became steady triggers. The challenge of sniping at -40 is more than romantic description. It is physiological fact. The body responds to extreme cold by constricting blood vessels in the extremities to preserve heat in the core. That means fingers become numb, stiff, and slow. Try threading a needle after submerging your hands in ice water, and you will understand what Soviet conscripts endured daily. Pulling a trigger smoothly, without jerking or trembling, is an act of fine motor control. For most soldiers in those temperatures, it was nearly impossible. Their shots veered, their bolts jammed from rough handling, their ability to reload deteriorated. Yet Häyhä maintained a precision that bordered on the unbelievable. His control was no accident, but the product of years of hunting in the same winters, conditioning his hands to function even when the body screamed to retreat. He layered clothing not with bulk, but with wisdom, wool closest to the skin, breathable fabrics that wicked away sweat, mittens with a design that allowed him to slip out a finger just long enough to squeeze a trigger before covering it again. He learned how to keep his body warm without overheating, because sweat was a death sentence in freezing weather. Moisture would freeze instantly, robbing him of heat and dexterity. By staying dry, he kept his hands usable for the long hours of stillness required to line up a shot. Many Soviet soldiers, trudging through snow in cotton underlayers that soaked up perspiration, froze because they had not learned this balance. Häyhä, however, had known since childhood that winter punished those who ignored its rules. His breathing also mattered. Shivering is the body's automatic response to generate heat through muscle activity, but shivering is the enemy of the marksman. The rifle must be steady, the sight picture must remain calm, the trigger pull must be smooth. Häyhä trained himself to control his body even in the grip of cold. He slowed his breathing, calmed his pulse, and found ways to accept the cold rather than fight it. Instead of struggling against every shiver, he learned to sink into the snowbank, to let his body adapt until stillness returned. The patience of the hunter became the antidote to the body's instinctive panic. Where others shook uncontrollably, he turned his body into a quiet platform for precision. The rifle itself posed its own trials. Metal contracts in the cold, bolts stiffen, oil congeals into glue. Soviet rifles often froze solid, their bolts snapping when forced. Häyhä avoided this by stripping his Mosin nagant of oil entirely, operating it dry. He knew that reliability mattered more than smoothness. The cold might stiffen steel, but with constant practice he learned exactly how much force was needed to operate the action without breaking it. Even his trigger discipline reflected this understanding. A trigger finger numbed by frost might overpull or jerk, but Häyhä's conditioned hand executed the same smooth squeeze every time, a reflex as natural as breathing. Then there was the frost itself. Moisture from breath or sweat could freeze to the rifle's surface. Soldiers who pressed their cheeks too hard to the stock risked tearing skin away when they moved. Häyhä prevented this by managing both his breath and his contact with the rifle, never allowing condensation to collect, never letting frost betray him. To fire in -40 is to make war not only against the enemy but against the elements that seize every molecule of water. For most, frost was a hazard. For him, it was another variable accounted for and dismissed. The body is not merely hands and fingers, though. Cold affects the mind as surely as the flesh. Hypothermia begins not with collapse, but with confusion, drowsiness, and impaired judgment. Soviet soldiers, inadequately clothed, often fell into these stages, making poor decisions, moving clumsily, or neglecting discipline. Häyhä had grown up in winters where a man who lost concentration while chopping wood or tending animals could freeze to death in his own yard. That upbringing gave him a mental toughness as much as a physical one. He did not view the cold as an enemy, but as a constant to be respected. This mindset preserved his clarity when others fell apart. The image of frozen fingers and a steady trigger also reveals something about his inner discipline. To shoot accurately in such conditions requires absolute trust in muscle memory. When feeling leaves the fingertips, when sensation is replaced by blunt pressure, the body must already know the right motion. Häyhä had drilled this into himself long before the war, firing thousands of rounds in competitions and hunts, practicing trigger pulls until they became instinct. So when the cold made sensation impossible, his body executed the motion anyway, clean and precise. The bullet flew true not because his fingers felt the trigger, but because they had repeated the act so many times that it bypassed feeling altogether. There is a paradox in cold. It destroys the unprepared, but rewards the adapted. Soviet soldiers, unused to Karelia's depths of winter, became victims of their environment. Häyhä, who had lived inside it all his life, turned it into an ally. -40, he did not merely survive. He functioned, and functioning was all he needed to be lethal. Each enemy who stumbled through snowdrifts in stiff boots and numb hands became a target for a man who could still lift, aim, and fire with unerring accuracy. Frozen fingers for them meant useless rifles. Frozen fingers for him still meant steady triggers. That difference, repeated across days and battles, explains as much of his success as his patience or his camouflage. The cold exaggerated the imbalance between the two armies. The Soviets had numbers, but their rifles froze. Their men shook uncontrollably. Their morale cracked. The Finns had fewer men, but they had knowledge of how to move, how to dress, how to endure. Häyhä was the epitome of that knowledge. His body and rifle became extensions of each other precisely because he had learned to control them in the one condition that broke others. When the Soviet commanders asked why one man could kill so many of their soldiers, the answer lay not only in marksmanship, but in physiology. He had mastered his own body in conditions where theirs betrayed them. To think of Simo Häyhä's legend is to imagine the long, patient wait in the snow, the white camouflage, the invisible shot. But beneath all that myth was something even more elemental. The ability to pull a trigger smoothly when the world itself was frozen stiff. That was the dividing line. One man turned -40 into routine, while thousands of others turned it into an excuse for error, fear, and defeat. Frozen fingers are supposed to shake, to stumble, to ruin precision. His did not. They curled around the trigger, squeezed without haste, and released death with mechanical certainty. That simple act, repeated hundreds of times in the worst of winter, is what turned a farmer with a rifle into the white death. A lone figure lying in the snow with a rifle seems too small, too fragile to shift the course of a war. And yet, in the Winter War, the story of Simo Häyhä shows how one soldier could stand as a symbol of resistance against a giant. His legend is not only about his own skill, though his patience, precision, and endurance were unmatched, but about the contrast between two armies, one massive, industrial, and poorly led, the other small, prepared, and deeply committed to survival. The White Death's success was amplified by the failures of Soviet strategy and the resilience of Finnish defense. In many ways, his tally of kills was not simply a personal achievement, but the arithmetic of an invasion gone wrong. The Soviet Union entered Finland with arrogance. Stalin's generals expected the campaign to last weeks, believing sheer numbers and firepower would crush a tiny nation. They had hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and aircraft, and the weight of an empire behind them. What they did not have was preparation for the land they entered. The forests of Karelia are not open fields suited for tanks and mass assaults. They are narrow roads hemmed in by snowdrifts and pines, frozen lakes that crack under pressure, and miles of deep powder that swallow anyone who tries to move off trail. Soviet columns found themselves trapped, bound to predictable routes and unable to maneuver. Each advance funneled into bottlenecks, and those bottlenecks became killing grounds for Finnish defenders. It was in these conditions that a man like Häyhä thrived. He did not need to roam far for targets. The Soviets came to him in endless streams, their dark uniforms glaring against the snow, their movements slow and noisy. Soviet commanders had purged many of their best officers in the years before the war, leaving behind a corps that relied on rigid orders and brute force. When ambushes shredded their lines, they responded with artillery and mass charges rather than adaptation. That rigidity turned every mistake into a catastrophe. For a patient sniper, it was a perfect storm. The Finnish defense, by contrast, was built on flexibility. Outnumbered, they adopted guerrilla-style tactics known as motti, breaking Soviet divisions into isolated pockets by striking at supply lines and columns. On skis, Finnish troops moved swiftly through forests, attacking from unexpected angles. harassing and retreating before the Soviets could react. Every soldier was expected to use the land, the snow, and the cold as weapons. In this environment, Häyhä was not an anomaly but an ideal. He represented the very essence of Finnish resilience, resourcefulness, discipline, and an unbreakable familiarity with the land. His extraordinary tally was the extreme version of what the Finnish army as a whole was doing, turning the environment into an ally and exposing Soviet flaws. The scale of Soviet mistakes provided him with opportunities no sniper in another war could dream of. In conflicts where armies fight maneuver battles across open fields, a sniper might see only a few targets a day, and those targets are usually cautious, alert, and difficult to hit. In Karelia, Häyhä faced troops who stumbled into his sights by the dozens, poorly camouflaged, exhausted, and often unaware of his presence until their comrades fell. The Soviet doctrine of mass assaults meant that soldiers were pushed forward again and again into kill zones, creating a supply of targets limited only by Häyhä's patience and ammunition. His skill ensured he rarely missed, but it was Soviet incompetence that kept delivering him fresh victims. The numbers also mask the collective nature of Finnish defense. Häyhä was never truly alone, even when he worked in solitude. He was part of units that coordinated ambushes, laid traps, and shaped the battlefield to expose enemies. His kills were personal, but they were also woven into a larger fabric of resistance. Each Soviet soldier who fell to his rifle was one less pressing against Finnish lines, one more blow to morale, one more reminder that this easy war was bleeding the Red Army dry. His legend spread quickly, but it carried with it the weight of an entire nation's resilience. He was the visible tip of a spear made of thousands of determined Finns. The Soviets themselves contributed to the legend through their failures to silence him. They tried artillery barrages, counter-snipers, and endless patrols, but none succeeded. Every failed attempt fed the myth of his invulnerability, which in turn deepened the fear among Soviet ranks. Soldiers marched not only against an army, but against the idea that an invisible hunter stalked them wherever they went. One man with a rifle became, in their imagination, a force larger than himself. This psychological effect was multiplied by the already low morale of troops freezing in inadequate clothing, plagued by frostbite, and misled by commanders who promised easy victories. The White Death was not just a sniper, but a manifestation of their own doubts and despair. And yet it is important to remember that Häyhä's legend could not have existed without the collective courage of the Finnish people. Entire villages contributed to the war effort, supplying clothing, food, and shelter for soldiers. Civilians endured bombings and shortages without surrender. The army, though small, was unified in purpose, its soldiers fighting for their homes rather than for ideology. Against this backdrop, one man's endurance became emblematic of a larger truth, that resilience can blunt the spearhead of overwhelming force. His 500 kills were a product of his skill, yes, but also of a society that had prepared him from birth to endure the cold, to shoot with precision, and to survive where others faltered. The narrative of one soldier against an army therefore has two sides. On one, it highlights the incredible discipline of Häyhä himself, a farmer turned warrior whose patience and steadiness made him a nightmare for invaders. On the other, it reveals the deep flaws of Soviet strategy which fed him opportunities until the number of dead piled into legend. It also underscores the broader resilience of the Finnish defense, which gave him the platform to succeed. Without the failure of Soviet tactics, without the unity of Finnish resistance, Häyhä would have been one skilled marksman among many. With them, he became the White Death. The lesson of his story is not only that individuals matter, but that individuals shine brightest when their environment and their adversaries' mistakes align. Häyhä was extraordinary, but his success was also systemic. It was the arrogance of an empire colliding with the stubbornness of a small nation, the weight of numbers undone by the weight of snow. One man against an army is not supposed to be possible. In Karelia it was. And the reason it was possible lies as much in Soviet blunders and Finnish resilience as in the steady hands of the sniper who never missed. The war that had turned Simo Häyhä into a living legend nearly ended him in a single moment of violence. For months he had lain in the snow, invisible and untouchable, the spectre the Soviets called the White Death. He had watched their columns stumble and break under fire, had cut down officers, gunners and scouts, and had endured artillery and counter-snipers without faltering. But no man, no matter how skilled, can remain invulnerable forever. On March 6, 1940, just days before the Winter War's end, his luck ran out. An explosive bullet struck his face, shattering his jaw, tearing away bone and flesh, and very nearly ending both his life and his story. The wound was catastrophic, the kind that should have killed him outright, yet he survived, and his survival became as much a part of his legend as the hundreds of kills that came before. The precise circumstances of that day are shrouded in the confusion that always clouds battlefields. Accounts agree that he was engaged in his usual work, lying in wait, watching Soviet movements through the forest. By that time, the Red Army had learned, if not to stop him, then at least to fear him enough to pour resources into silencing his rifle. Patrols hunted for him constantly, artillery hammered suspected nests, and counter-snipers prowled the forests looking for the faintest sign of his presence. On that early March morning, one of those hunters finally succeeded. A Soviet marksman fired an explosive bullet, and by sheer chance or skill, it struck Häyhä directly in the face. Explosive rounds were brutal in their effects. Unlike standard bullets, which punched through flesh in straight wounds, these were designed to fragment, to tear apart what they struck. When the round hit Häyhä's jaw, it destroyed it almost entirely, shattering bone and ripping away skin. Teeth were blown from his mouth, his lower face all but obliterated. Comrades who reached him later recalled the horrifying sight. His face unrecognizable, blood soaking into the snow, fragments of jawbone scattered in the wound. For a man who had survived months of lethal cold and endless fire, it was the cruelest of injuries, sudden and devastating. And yet, even in that moment, fate spared him. He did not die instantly. Unconscious, mangled, but alive, he was dragged from the field by his fellow Finns. They carried him through the snow, risking their own lives under fire, determined that this symbol of resistance would not be left to die where he had fallen. That he survived transport at all is remarkable, given the state of his injury. Severe facial trauma often causes suffocation as blood fills the throat or swelling blocks the airway. Infection in those conditions is almost inevitable. But Häyhä endured the journey back, clinging to life even as his comrades feared he had none left. He would remain unconscious for days. Surgeons worked desperately to piece him back together, cleaning the wound, removing fragments and trying to reconstruct what had been destroyed. In an era before advanced antibiotics and reconstructive techniques, such an injury was often fatal not because of the initial trauma, but because of the infection and complications that followed. Yet Häyhä's constitution, hardened by a lifetime of cold, labor and discipline, carried him through. He lingered in a coma-like state, his body fighting to heal, and when he finally awoke, it was to a changed face and a changed world. The war was over. On March 13th, Finland and the Soviet Union signed a peace treaty, ceding territory but preserving independence. Häyhä awoke on March 13th itself, the very day the treaty was signed, spared from the war's end by a twist of timing as cruel as it was poetic. The cost of survival was immense. His jaw was gone, his face permanently altered. Photographs taken later in life show the scars that marked him forever, reminders of the explosive round that nearly took his life. he survived, not just physically, but spiritually. Unlike many who suffer catastrophic injuries, Häyhä did not retreat into despair or bitterness. He accepted the wound as part of his story, another battle endured. For a man who had spent his life in silence, tending farms, hunting in forests, waiting for hours in snowbanks, the disfigurement of his face did not change his essence. He was still Simo, the quiet farmer turned defender. The face may have been broken, but the will remained intact. Survival after such an injury required not only medical care, but an extraordinary resilience of character. Eating, drinking, and speaking all became challenges in the months that followed. Surgeons reconstructed as best they could, using grafts and rudimentary techniques. Recovery was slow and painful, requiring endurance as surely as the cold and the battlefield once had. Häyhä endured it as he endured everything else, patiently, silently, without complaint. His later life reflected this same stoicism. Though he never fully regained his old appearance, he returned to his farm, raised hunting dogs, and lived quietly, refusing to let the wound define him more than the war already had. The symbolic power of his injury cannot be overlooked. To his comrades, his survival was a miracle, proof that the White Death could not be killed, even by the most catastrophic blow. To the Soviets, his wounding may have been a small victory, but it came too late. The war was already lost in spirit, the myth of his invulnerability already secured. His blood in the snow did not erase his legend, it deepened it, adding a final chapter of endurance to the story of his lethality. The scarred face became as much a part of his identity as the white camouflage. He had killed hundreds, endured the cold, outwitted an army, and even when struck down by a bullet designed to destroy, he survived. There is a human truth here that transcends warfare. Everyone knows that skill and discipline can create success, but survival often hinges on endurance and luck. Häyhä's life was a testament to both. The same man who had practiced patience in hunting, who had trained his body to accept the cold, who had learned to live invisibly in the snow, now had to endure the slow, grueling process of recovery. The patience that once guided his finger on the trigger now guided him through months of pain. The stillness he had mastered in ambush now became the stillness of hospital beds and healing. The day he was struck could easily have been the end of his story, a tragic conclusion to a brilliant career. Instead, it became a turning point. He had fought his war, done his part, and carried more than any one man could reasonably be asked to carry. Fate, in its cruelty, left him alive, scarred and silenced, but it also left him victorious. He had endured the unendurable and lived to see his country survive. In that sense, his survival was more than personal. It was symbolic of Finland itself, battered, scarred, forced to concede territory, but unbroken, alive, and still free. When people recall Simo Häyhä, they often focus on the staggering numbers of his kills, on the image of the man invisible in the snow. But the wound that almost ended him is just as important. It reminds us that he was not a ghost, but a man of flesh and blood, vulnerable to chance, capable of being struck down. His legend rests not only on the destruction he inflicted, but on the endurance he showed when destruction came for him. The White Death was not invincible, but he was unyielding. Even with his jaw destroyed, even with his face torn apart, he lived, and in living, he turned survival itself into victory. That survival, quiet and unsung, may be the truest measure of his strength. Hundreds of kills made him feared. The scar that never healed made him human. And together those truths complete the picture of the man who lay in the snow with a steady trigger, who faced down the cold, who fought an army, and who, even when struck by death itself, refused to leave the battlefield on anything but his own terms. The war ended with Finland battered but unbroken, scarred by the loss of territory, yet proud that it had resisted one of the largest armies in the world for over 3 months. For Simo Häyhä, the end of the Winter War did not come with parades or speeches but with silence. When the peace treaty was signed in March 1940, he was lying in a hospital bed, his face mangled by the explosive bullet that had nearly killed him. While the nation mourned its dead and counted its losses, he fought the quiet personal battle of survival. His jaw was shattered, much of his lower face destroyed, his body weakened from weeks of blood loss and fever. For days, he drifted in unconsciousness, unaware that the war was already over. When he finally awoke, Finland was no longer fighting, and his role in the war had ended in blood and fire. Recovery was long and painful. Reconstructive surgery in the early 1940s was crude compared to modern standards. Surgeons could attempt grafts, could try to piece together what was left of bone and tissue, but the damage was severe. Häyhä's face would never return to what it had been. He lost much of his jaw, his ability to speak was impaired, and eating was difficult. He underwent dozens of procedures over the years to rebuild some semblance of structure, but the scars never disappeared. Photographs from his later life show a man whose features bore the unmistakable stamp of violence. Sunken cheeks, uneven lines, a face that told the story of survival before words ever could. Yet even through this ordeal, he showed the same endurance he had displayed in the forests. There are no records of self-pity, no dramatic complaints. He accepted his injury as he accepted the cold, as he accepted the endless hours of waiting in ambush. Life for him was a matter of enduring what must be endured. In many ways, the patience that made him a sniper also made him a survivor. Recovery was not glamorous. It was slow, quiet, and often lonely. But he did it, step by step, until he could return to the rhythms of ordinary life. When the Continuation War broke out in 1941, Finland once again found itself fighting the Soviet Union, this time alongside Nazi Germany. By then, Häyhä's injuries had left him unfit for frontline service. He had already given more than anyone could ask, and though his heart might have longed to return to the snow with his rifle, his body had been too badly damaged. Instead, he lived through those years away from the battlefield, a reminder that war leaves not only graves but also men whose lives are permanently altered. He spent his days recovering, tending to practical matters, and waiting for peace to return so he could resume the only life he had ever truly wanted, farming. And so, when the wars finally ended and Finland began to rebuild, Häyhä returned to the soil. Farming had always been his world, long before he became the White Death. He had grown up in the village of Rautjärvi, working land that demanded the same endurance as war, early mornings, hard labor, and patience with seasons that could be cruel. After the war, he went back to that rhythm. He raised hunting dogs, worked his fields, and built a quiet life away from the eyes of the world. It is striking that a man who had become one of the deadliest snipers in history slipped so easily back into anonymity. While others might have paraded their reputation, Häyhä rarely spoke of his wartime record. When asked, he gave simple, laconic answers, as if the whole matter were unremarkable. Once, when pressed on how he had managed so many kills, he simply said, "Practice." It was the reply of a farmer, plain and understated, reducing extraordinary skill to the habits of daily repetition. His silence was not the silence of shame, but of character. He had never fought for glory. He had fought because his country was invaded, because his home was threatened. To boast about the lives he had taken would have been, in his view, senseless. The war was over. The fields still needed to be tended and life went on. Friends and neighbours knew him as a quiet man, reserved, fond of his dogs, and still an avid hunter. When he spoke of the war, it was usually not of his record, but of small practical details: the cold, the discipline, the patience. He left the myth-making to others. The Finnish government recognized his service. He was promoted from corporal to second lieutenant, a remarkable leap in rank that acknowledged his extraordinary contribution. He received decorations and was celebrated in newspapers. But he never sought the spotlight, never used his reputation to carve out a public role. He chose instead to live as he always had, close to the land, close to the forests where he had learned to hunt long before he ever hunted men. The scarred face and the quiet life became a paradox. Here was a man who had done what few in history ever achieved, becoming the deadliest sniper the world had ever known. And yet he lived as if none of it mattered. Perhaps this was his way of carrying the weight of memory. To speak of 500 dead is to revisit 500 moments of violence. 500 times he looked down iron sights and squeezed a trigger. Perhaps silence was his way of keeping those memories from overwhelming him. Or perhaps he simply believed that the war had been a collective effort, that his role, however large, was just one piece of Finland's survival. He never presented himself as a hero, never revelled in his reputation. He remained, at heart, the farmer who had gone to war because he had no other choice. In later years, he found a measure of peace in hunting and in the companionship of friends who respected his privacy. He was known to enjoy visiting the wilderness with his dogs, returning to the quiet stalk of animals in the forest, the kind of hunting that had first given him his skill. He seemed to find comfort in those old rhythms, as if by returning to them he could close the circle of his life, back to the trees, the snow, and the silence that had always been his home. As time passed and his legend spread abroad, journalists and historians came seeking interviews. Häyhä received them politely but remained terse. He gave answers in a few words, avoiding elaboration. He never tried to inflate his record, never embellished. His demeanour frustrated some who wanted dramatic stories, but it also preserved the authenticity of his character. He was not a man of words. He was a man of action, and once the action had ended, he saw no reason to dwell on it. In 1998, decades after the Winter War, he was invited to meet with military officers and young marksmen who regarded him as a legend. He was an old man by then, white-haired, his face still bearing the scars of that explosive bullet. He greeted them with the same modesty he had shown all his life. They asked him how he had done it, how he had managed to endure, how he had killed so many. His answer was the same as always: practice. Behind those words lay decades of silence, of patience, of refusing to turn himself into a myth. The myth existed, but it was crafted by others. He remained himself, simple, quiet, unassuming. Simo Häyhä died in 2002 at the age of 96. He had outlived the Soviet officers who once tried to kill him, outlived the war itself, and outlived the Cold War that followed. He lived long enough to see Finland become prosperous and independent, long enough to see his legend grow larger than he ever intended. In his final years, he remained the same, private, modest, living in the countryside with his memories. When he passed, Finland mourned him as a hero, but those who knew him remembered him as a quiet man who never let fame alter his nature. His life after the war was not one of parades or endless retellings of battles. It was a return to the soil, to the dogs, to the forests. That return says more about him than any statistic. For Simo Häyhä, war was a duty, not an identity. His identity remained what it had always been: a farmer in the snow, a man who understood patience, who endured pain, who lived quietly after he had done what needed to be done. In that quiet life he found a dignity greater than glory, and in that silence his legend only grew louder. Legends are rarely born in peace. They come from the fog of conflict, from desperate armies searching for symbols, from enemies trying to name their fears. and from ordinary people who need stories to make sense of extraordinary times. The legend of Simo Häyhä followed that arc. In the frozen months of the Winter War, when Finland fought against impossible odds, the story of one small farmer turned sniper spread across the front lines through villages and eventually beyond Finland's borders. He was hailed as the White Death, a name that captured both awe and dread. Yet, as with all legends, the line between fact and myth blurred. The numbers, the tales, the interpretations, some were accurate, others inflated, and all of them shaped by the needs of war and memory. To trace the myth and memory of Häyhä is to see how one man's actions became more than personal deeds, how they transformed into a cultural touchstone that still resonates long after the last snow of that war melted. In Finland, during the Winter War, morale was as critical as rifles. The country was small, its resources limited, its army outnumbered and outgunned by a Soviet force that dwarfed it in every metric. The Finns could not produce victory in sheer numbers, but they could cultivate belief. Belief that courage, skill, and resilience could even the odds. Stories of snipers killing dozens, of ski troops encircling massive Soviet formations, and of small villages resisting artillery fire became lifelines for the spirit of the people. Into this atmosphere, Häyhä's kill count became a kind of national talisman. Each time his tally grew, newspapers whispered of his feats, soldiers passed along the number, and citizens found in his existence the proof that one man could stand against many. For Finns, he was not simply a soldier, he was Finland itself, embodied in a single figure, patient, disciplined, and unyielding. The Soviets, for their part, did not create the name White Death to glorify him, but to articulate their terror. Soviet soldiers facing invisible fire in the forests needed a name for what they feared. The moniker turned him into a figure larger than life, almost supernatural, a hunter who could not be seen until it was too late. The nickname travelled back through Soviet ranks and reached Finnish ears, where it was adopted with pride. To be named by the enemy was to have one's impact confirmed. What began as whispered dread became a badge of honour, a story retold with each new skirmish. In this way, his myth was fueled as much by his adversaries as by his own countrymen. But propaganda played its role too. The Finnish military understood the value of heroes. In a war where entire divisions could be crushed by artillery, a single figure of success gave hope. Häyhä's record was tallied, reported, and spread intentionally. Numbers were highlighted because they carried weight. 5 kills today, 10 tomorrow, another 100 by the end of the month. The exact figures may have blurred in the process. Was it 500 or more or less? In the chaos of war, few records could be perfectly accurate. Bodies fell, snow buried them, battles raged on. Counting kills was less science than estimation, relying on reports from comrades and officers. Yet the very uncertainty allowed the legend to grow. If not 500, why not 6? Why not more? Each retelling magnified him until his shadow stretched across the entire front. The international press seized on the story as well. The Winter War drew attention because it was a David and Goliath conflict, a tiny democracy resisting the vast machine of the Soviet Union. Journalists, always eager for symbols, found in Häyhä the perfect character. He was not an aristocrat, not an officer, not even a career soldier. He was a farmer, small in stature, quiet in demeanour, who with iron sights and simple discipline became the deadliest sniper in history. It was irresistible copy. Western papers portrayed him as proof that ordinary men could rise to extraordinary heights. They emphasized his modest background, his silence, his practical answers. In doing so, they turned him into something even larger than a hero. They turned him into a parable of resilience. Over time, the myth detached from the man. In Finnish villages after the war, people spoke of him as though he were more spirit than human. Children heard of the White Death and imagined a ghost who haunted the snow, not a flesh and blood farmer who limped home with a shattered jaw. Foreign readers absorbed inflated accounts that suggested he was invulnerable, a supernatural force no bullet could touch. The reality, that he was a skilled marksman, disciplined and patient, yet wounded almost fatally like any other man, was overshadowed by the legend. Memory prefers clarity to nuance, and the White Death became the clarity of Finnish defiance distilled into one name. Häyhä himself contributed little to this myth. He remained silent about his deeds, giving short answers when asked, deflecting questions with humility. In that silence, others filled the void. His refusal to boast only deepened the aura around him. People imagined that if he would not speak of his record, it must be because it was too immense, too terrible, too sacred. The myth grew stronger not because of his words, but because of his lack of them. Silence became part of the legend, a blank canvas on which Finns and foreigners alike could paint their own visions of who the White Death was. Separating fact from propaganda is not simple. Did he kill exactly 500? No one can say for certain. The numbers came from wartime reports that may have been inflated to lift spirits. What is certain is that he killed hundreds, perhaps more than any sniper before or since, in just over 100 days. That alone is astonishing enough, yet myth demands round numbers, clean milestones. 500 became the figure etched into history because it was large, memorable, and symbolic. It was less about accuracy and more about meaning. The number told a story, that one man could stand against an army, that precision could defeat mass, that Finland's spirit could not be crushed. In the decades after the war, as Finland rebuilt and moved forward, the myth persisted, but its tone shifted. During the war, the legend had been about survival and defiance. In peace, it became about memory and national pride. Veterans told stories of Häyhä to younger generations, not only as tales of war, but as lessons about patience, discipline, and endurance. His legend entered history books, documentaries, and eventually the internet, where his face, scarred yet calm, circulated alongside his kill count. Each retelling added to the aura, until the White Death became not merely a Finnish hero, but a global symbol of sniping itself. Yet myths are double-edged. Some criticized the way his story was told, worrying that it glorified killing rather than remembering the cost. Others argued that by focusing on one man, the collective struggle of the Finnish army was overshadowed. And of course, Soviet sources dismissed parts of the story as exaggeration, though even they could not deny the fear he inspired among their soldiers. The debate itself kept the legend alive, as arguments over numbers and facts continued to circulate. Myths thrive in controversy, in the tension between those who believe and those who doubt. For Häyhä, the man beneath the legend, the myth was both a burden and a shield. He lived quietly, never correcting the stories, never embellishing them, simply allowing them to exist. Perhaps he knew that Finland needed the myth more than it needed the man. Perhaps he preferred to be remembered as a symbol rather than as a farmer who had once been forced to kill. Or perhaps he simply did not care, content to return to his fields and his dogs, letting others build whatever memory suited them. The White Death is remembered today as the deadliest sniper in history, his name etched into military lore. But to understand him fully is to see the interplay of fact and story. He was indeed a farmer who became a soldier, indeed a man who killed hundreds, indeed someone who survived a wound that should have ended him. But he was also a myth, shaped by propaganda, fear, and memory into something larger than himself. That duality is the essence of myth and memory. The man exists, but so does the legend, and together they tell us not only about him, but about the people who needed his story. In the end, Simo Häyhä's story belongs to both history and folklore. Fact tells us he was a skilled marksman who fought with discipline in one of the harshest wars of the 20th century. Myth tells us he was the White Death, a ghost in the snow who defied an empire. Neither alone is sufficient. Together they capture the truth of how humans remember war, not as a collection of data points, but as stories we pass down, stories that remind us of endurance, resilience, and the extraordinary things that ordinary men can do when history demands it. The story of Simo Häyhä is not just about marksmanship or a kill count that defies belief. To focus only on the numbers is to miss the deeper truth embedded in his life and actions. His legend is, at its core, a study in endurance, adaptation, and the psychology of survival, when every element of nature and war conspires to crush the individual. What makes him extraordinary is not simply that he could shoot straight, but that he could endure conditions that broke other men, adapt his body and mind to a hostile environment, and preserve clarity of purpose in the midst of chaos. The lessons of the White Death are not confined to warfare. They are insights into human resilience itself. The first lesson is about endurance. At -40 degrees, the body is not an ally. Muscles stiffen, joints ache, nerves dull, and the simplest action, breathing, holding, squeezing a trigger, becomes a battle. To lie motionless for hours in snow that seeps cold into the bones is to court frostbite and exhaustion. Most men shiver uncontrollably after a short time, losing the steadiness needed for accuracy. Yet Häyhä endured this daily, not for hours, but for weeks on end, over 100 days of constant exposure. His ability to remain still in such conditions was not merely physical toughness. It was the culmination of a lifetime spent in the forests, of a childhood where winter was not a season to fear but a reality to master. He had learned long before the war that the cold could be survived, not by fighting it, but by accepting it, by moving within its limits rather than against them. Endurance, in his case, was not dramatic defiance, but quiet familiarity. Adaptation is the second lesson. Häyhä did not bring high technology into battle. He chose an iron-sighted Mosin Nagant over scoped rifles because he understood that scopes could fog, could glint in the sun, could betray him. He tamped down the snow around his rifle to prevent it from puffing with each shot. He placed snow in his mouth to conceal his breath. These were not tricks taught in manuals. They were the creative adaptations of a man who observed carefully and adjusted. Where Soviet soldiers blundered in dark uniforms across glaring white landscapes, Häyhä dressed in full camouflage, making himself indistinguishable from the snow. Where others thought in terms of equipment, he thought in terms of environment, adapting not only tools but habits. His genius was not innovation for its own sake, but a practical willingness to do what was necessary, no matter how small or unconventional the detail. The third lesson lies in the psychology of survival. Häyhä's patience was not just a tactical choice, it was a mental discipline. Most men crave movement, relief from monotony, action to break silence. Lying still for hours, waiting for the right moment, is as much a psychological strain as a physical one. It requires silencing the mind's demands, restraining the urge to act. His ability to wait without restlessness, to remain calm while others grew frantic, was a psychological advantage. In war, the impatient reveal themselves, the disciplined survive. His kills were not only the result of aiming, but of refusing to waste effort, of striking only when certainty aligned with opportunity. This restraint conserved his energy, his ammunition, and his safety. It is the mindset of survival, patience over impulse, control over chaos. The White Death also demonstrates the importance of turning disadvantages into strengths. The cold that crippled Soviet troops became his ally. Their breath betrayed them. Their clumsy gloves ruined their aim. Their weapons jammed from frozen oil. Häyhä, having adapted to the same cold, found himself advantaged. He stripped his rifle of oil, fired it dry, knowing it would not freeze. He managed his clothing layers to prevent sweat, understanding that wetness was death. He allowed the cold to serve him by exposing his enemy's weaknesses, while his own discipline neutralized it. This inversion, turning the environment into an ally rather than an enemy, is one of the clearest lessons of his story. Survival often belongs not to the strongest, but to those who can align themselves with conditions rather than resist them. Another lesson is the role of simplicity. Modern minds often equate complexity with superiority, assuming more technology, more equipment, more resources mean greater success. Häyhä proved the opposite. His rifle was simple, his methods basic, his choices austere. He did not complicate his role with gadgets or unnecessary movement. Simplicity allowed him reliability. In extreme conditions, the more complex a tool, the more points of failure it has. His rejection of the scope, his reliance on natural camouflage, his straightforward patience all reflect a philosophy of simplicity that outlasted Soviet abundance. Endurance thrives when stripped of excess, when every action is essential. The psychology of fear also plays heavily into his story. He weaponized invisibility, understanding that killing a soldier was only half the work. The other half was instilling dread in those who survived. By remaining unseen, by striking unpredictably, he created a constant sense of vulnerability in his enemies. Soviet soldiers marched in fear not only of artillery or tanks, but of the silent bullet from nowhere. That fear slowed them, drained their morale, and multiplied his impact far beyond the individual lives he took. Fear is survival's twin. If you control it, you thrive. If you succumb, you break. Häyhä controlled fear in himself and cultivated it in others. This asymmetry shows how psychology can outweigh brute force. At the heart of all of this is humility. He never saw himself as a hero, never boasted of his record. Asked how he achieved so many kills, he answered with one word: practice. Behind that word lies the truest lesson. Endurance is not the product of sudden effort. It is built day by day, through repetition, through practice, through small disciplines that accumulate until they define a man. Häyhä's life as a farmer and hunter had been nothing but practice for the war. Every hour spent skiing through forests, every morning spent in the biting cold tending to animals, every patient wait for a deer to step into sight. All of it had trained him. The lesson is that survival is not improvised, but cultivated, often without knowing it, in the ordinary rigors of daily life. There is also a lesson in the way he bore his wound. When the explosive bullet tore apart his face, survival should have ended. Yet he endured surgery, pain, and lifelong scars without complaint. He returned to farming, to hunting, to the quiet life, refusing to let disfigurement dominate his identity. This resilience after the war mirrors his resilience during it. It shows that endurance is not only for battlefields, it is for the long life afterward, when scars remain and one must find dignity in ordinary existence. Häyhä endured not only extreme cold and relentless enemies, but also the weight of memory and injury. He proved that survival is a lifelong act, not a single event. Perhaps the deepest lesson of the White Death is that extraordinary achievement can come from ordinary men. He was not tall, not flamboyant, not a career soldier with years of elite training. He was a farmer, quiet, modest, whose strength lay in discipline, patience, and adaptation. His story strips away the illusion that greatness belongs only to the extraordinary by birth. Instead, it shows that resilience, endurance, and survival are cultivated through ordinary lives lived with rigor. The snow, the farm, the forest, these were his teachers long before war made him famous. In the end, Häyhä's tactics reveal something universal. Survival in extreme conditions demands acceptance, adaptation, simplicity, patience, and control of fear. His endurance was not superhuman. It was human, perfected. He did what anyone might do, but he did it without faltering, without giving in to impatience or despair. That is why his legend endures. It is not just that he killed 500 men. It is that he showed what a human being, small and scarred, can endure when the world demands everything. The White Death teaches us that survival is as much a matter of the mind as of the body, and that in the silence of snow where everything freezes, the steady trigger belongs to those who have mastered both.